Welcome back to the channel. This is Trinity Storm and you're watching second and final part of What If Naruto Was Left Behind by Jiraiya during 3 years training trip. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The village was too far to the south for temperatures to frequently fall below zero, so Konoha didn't experience much winter. Even though there had been no snowfall that year prior to Naruto's departure, the weather was unusually wet and the winds from the west were cold. Since then, the rain has only increased in frequency, as if it were the summer and rainy season rather than late winter. It began on the day that Hokage Jiji was buried, or rather, his ashes were buried because no one wanted to risk a repeat of the Edo Tensei disaster. Naruto concluded that it was quite depressing that it was even wetter than in water country. However, at least fewer people were out that day due to the terrible weather. Everyone who could be inside was on duty, of course, because being a devoted shinobi wasn't something that was cancelled because trouts were swimming practically at shoulder level. Except for one so-called blue beast of Konoha and his pupil, who were yelling that the flames of the youth were keeping them dry while running around Konoha atop the Great Wall. With his jaw slightly agape, Taiki managed to say, "Was that some kind of defensive genjutsu?" "I think the sunset and the petals of the cherry blossoms were," Tsubaki-chan muttered, pushing her damp hair away from her face. "I had forgotten how, intense that can get." As Sai gazed at Naruto, she questioned, "Is that even legal to do in public?" He was wearing more of an expression than any of them had ever managed to extract from the boy. "Technically yes, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. You try that and they will dress you in green skin-tight spandex and wake you up every morning at 4:30 and before you know it you'll be speaking with capital letters too, and then you can't ever pull off an infiltration mission again," Sai was warned. If Sai's life had depended on it, he couldn't have pulled one off now, but that was a pointless detail. Sai was strange enough to believe that forming a trio out of the youthful duo was a good idea, and he was constantly asking wildly inappropriate questions, such as about sexual practices, from that one monk who essentially swallowed his tongue. Recalling one of Uruka sensei's earlier lessons, Naruto concluded that this would be a war crime of some kind. He also reasoned that committing war crimes in peace would be even more depressing than wet winter. When he said, "Okay, this is our plan," Sai nodded and took a stack of papers out of his pouch. When he said, "You, Sasuke, are our ticket through the gates without search." "I mean, Sai should have travel papers. You have them, right?" The travel documents were a straightforward pass informing anyone who saw them that the Hokage had sent a person named here on a sanctified mission. Without those, a nin could still return to Konoha, but with them, it was as easy as entering the gate after the two Chunin standing guards verified that you were the recipient of the documents. Nins were required to stand in front of the gates if they misplaced the papers, and the guards on duty went above and beyond to make sure the person in front of them had left Konoha legally and wasn't actually missing. If they didn't, they would be reprimanded for losing the papers, unless there were exceptional circumstances. "Great, so Taiki's defecting and that's why he hasn't got papers. Everybody's going to make ballyhoo about you returning, so no one should pay too much attention to Taiki and Kabuto anyway if they insist on bothering by the book and keeping you, though. Are you okay with that?" He tilted his head toward Taiki. "Of course," the irritably parched man said, looking shocked that he was even questioned once more. It had to be the Kiri thing. He gave the orders, and Taiki reassured him that he had no intention of lying to the T and I at all, even if Morino Ibiki was the one conducting the review. "Okay, if they keep you, try to stall when you tell them things. It's probably going to be at least half an hour before they get anyone to review you, and after that just tell them about things before Kabuto came in detail. Lots of details, but don't lie. That's only going to get you into trouble," he said. The fact that people were so afraid of the man was kind of funny. He may have been sour and intimidating, but he must have had a good heart because he hadn't pulled Idate back after that T-country race. He turned his focus to the topic of this whole commotion and asked, "So Kabuto, can you make some sort of genjutsu that gets you through?" His fingers moved through a plethora of seals so fast they appeared to blur, and then Naruto found himself staring at a U next to his friend. "Of course, Naruto-sama, I won't be invisible per se, but I will affect people's perception of me to make myself uninteresting with Sasuke as a distraction. This should be enough." It was a good one, huh? Though for entirely different reasons, he thought about Danzo and Sakura-chan as he led his merry, and not so merry, in the case of Sasuke and Sai, bunch to the great gates after Orochimaru and Sasuke's foolishness. It had been a long, wretched winter filled with one problem after another, but it was finally over. Izuko and Katetsu's eyes grew rounder than Lee's as Naruto marched up the road while whistling. Haruno Sakura was seated on her bed, studying one of her sensei's medical scrolls on the subject of leg muscles. The hamstring group includes the biceps femoris. Sakura briefly pushed the scroll aside and reviewed all of her memories of that specific muscle. Two heads joined to separate muscle groups, but what was the lower head portion of again? It was a lateral muscle of the posterior thigh. It stretched from the lateral condyle of the tibia to the ischial tuberosity. The long head shared a tendon with the semitendinosus muscle, correct? It flexed the knee and extended the thigh. She glanced at the scroll and realized that, although her knowledge had obviously been lacking, she had remembered correctly. A muscle that is frequently injured during physical activities requiring explosive knee bending, like sprinting, is the biceps femoris. The ninja may sustain a hamstring strain or rupture, which is the tearing of the hamstring muscle, if they were exhausted or had not warmed up adequately. The complete separation of the biceps femoris tendon from the bone was known as an avulsion. Tsunade-sama's medical scrolls, which detailed all the amazing ways ninja life could damage the human body even in the absence of direct enemy contact, were a very depressing read. Tsunade-sama was going to make her mend anything that was torn, so she had recently had to fight the urge to scream at a certain green-clad genin to be careful with his tendons. Damn it. Sakura. With her heart thumping, Sakura leapt from her slump, but before she could even turn around, her window was flung open, and Ino leapt onto her bed beside her. The mattress dipped beneath their feet as Ino pulled Sakura to stand up and demanded, "What are you still doing here? Haven't you heard?" Sakura's previously immaculate, white sheets already had multiple muddy scuffs from Ino's sandals, which she was still wearing. Sakura's temple began to pound with a familiar annoyance. Where had the manners gone to? She started to rant, "Someone better have invaded us again, Ino, but Ino simply shook her. When Ino exclaimed, "Sasuke's back," Sakura was unable to move or speak as she stood there dumbfounded. Blood hammered in her ears. Ino continued. Naruto returned with him a short while ago. They visited Godem-sama's office. A Kiri-junin named Doihara defected. I wonder how he's related to this. Wasn't Sasuke in Auto? Sasuke had returned. Sakura was unsure of how to react when Sasuke returned. After Sasuke left, she had time to consider what she had done, and she felt extremely embarrassed. Fortunately, only Sasuke knew the first part, possibly the worst part, and she had offered to go with him. Even though she had been upset with Sasuke after seeing her friends in the hospital, she was thankful that he had at least prevented her from ruining her life in that way. It had been a foolish, last-minute decision. She would have missed Ino and her parents, and she would never have been able to go back to her home to be with Naruto and even Kakashi-sensei. Her foolishness would have likely caused her to die young, but Naruto wouldn't have allowed it. Naruto. She now had yet another reason to feel ashamed. She had been too weak to even try it herself, and he had ended up in a hospital for his trouble, so she had asked him to bring Sasuke back. Even so, that had been a low point for Naruto. Not that she wouldn't have attempted to bring Sasuke back before Orochimaru took over. She had vowed to get stronger so they could work together and, if needed, drag Sasuke back by force. However, Naruto had fulfilled that pledge during her time spent studying the human body's muscles. She continued to smile wildly in spite of everything. Go. Go? Ino shoved her, and Sakura bounded into action, disregarding her muscles and tendons. It wasn't until her feet touched the ground after she leapt out of her window that she realized she was still barefoot. She was nearly instantly soaked as the icy mud splashed between her toes. She cried, "My sandals, Ino!" The next second, Ino threw a pair of blue standard-issue sandals out of the window. Normally, shoes were left by the front door, but Ninja kept their footwear close at hand. In just one more second, she was sprinting. Sakura wouldn't have been shocked if the cherry trees of Konoha had begun to bloom there and then, due to the sheer intensity of her happiness, even though it wasn't quite spring according to the calendar. At least she could be happy that Sasuke and Naruto were back together. Even if she didn't know what else to feel about them, it sang in her ears like birdsong and bubbled through her veins as if her blood had somehow been turned into soda. Sakura declared that spring had finally arrived, and Team 7 was whole again. To the foxes with the calendar. One Senju saying that Tsunade's father had told her was, "A man will promise a lot of things in summer he won't mean in winter." Konoha as a whole used a similar saying, drawing comparisons between making and delivering babies and promises. Words were cheap, making promises was simple, taking action was difficult. The only shinobi Tsunade had ever known was foolish enough to swear not to die, never to go on duty, and to genuinely believe what he said. Naruto had an unusually upbeat demeanor and made a lot of promises. She was beginning to think that he might somehow pull that off in his case. It was more about somehow distorting reality and making winter into summer than it was about gritting his teeth through the winter, though he could do that too. The promise he had given Sakura was now a reality. She sincerely hoped he hadn't fulfilled it in this manner. "And you accused Danzo of what?" she said, with her aching temples being massaged. She urgently needed more alcohol. "His actions include, but are not limited to, several counts of unsolicited assassination of Konoha citizens." unlawfully taking Konohan orphans into custody, which I believe counts as kidnapping, to indoctrinate them into members of an organization Sandaime Hokage made illegal and disbanded, conspiring with a foreign leader, Salamander Hanzo. Without the knowledge of the Hokage, the silver-haired boy, who was now a man, continued with an almost maniacal glee in his eyes, oblivious to the two Anbu who were standing ready to kill him at Tsunade's whim, their blades drawn. Tsubaki, who appeared far too unrepentant for letting this madness happen in the first place, Kiri Anbu, who was reportedly a Konoha shinobi and still defecting to Konoha, Naruto, who was giving her a look that was both pleading and so trusting that it made her stomach turn, and Naruto flanked him. Flinching at the betrayed expression in Naruto's bright, blue eyes, she grounded out, "And can you give me a reason why I should believe a spy of Orochimaru?" Damn it, being vulnerable was not a Hokage trait, especially in front of someone who would undoubtedly see it and exploit it. "I'm currently a member of the Root, Hokage-sama," said Sai, who was quiet, overpowering them. "I'm a Konoha shinobi, yet not in the register. I'm an orphan Danzo took, yet I doubt papers for my custody exist. I was sent to Makima to assess Junin Ono Tsubaki's loyalties and assassinate her if I found her traitorous. I don't believe this mission was endorsed by you, and it wasn't. Damn it all, going behind her back like this was a crime in and of itself, and evidence that the leopard hadn't changed its spots at all. All missions of this kind had to be assigned by the Hokage himself. She should probably get over her dislike of her traitorous teammate's alleged ex-flunky and listen to what he had to say, especially since the Root was still around." Darkly, "You have half an hour," she said. "Start convincing me." She quickly regretted what she had said. It wasn't helping her with this any more than it had with cards, despite her best efforts to maintain her poker face. Even though their faces were obscured by the frozen porcelain grins, the Anbu in her office were clearly shocked as well. Their body language was increasingly expressing shock and dismay. After putting himself between Kabuto and Sai, Naruto was now holding their hands, his face flushed from some weird exertion, and his chakra flared in a way that made her uneasy. She had never wanted to be Hokage in the first place because of things like this. She couldn't let this travesty continue if even half of what she had just heard, or even a tenth or a fraction of a fraction, were true. She now had to defeat Danzo, which would undoubtedly be a nightmare. "Enough, enough. I have heard enough. So now you profess loyalty to Konoha again? Despite everything?" She responded suspiciously. Kabuto had already demonstrated his dishonesty and retaliation. Had he come back only to get even? If his story had been true, she couldn't really hold him accountable for such intentions. "My primary loyalty is to Naruto-sama, but since he intends to become the Hokage, it will amount to the same thing in the end," the kid replied, unperturbed. His smile could make him appear so innocent. He and Naruto and how that had happened was another story Tsunade needed to hear, but she wasn't sure she could handle hearing it at the moment. She pointed a delicate finger at Doihara and yelled, "And you are defecting to us because of what?" The man jumped a little, but he responded right away. "Naruto decided that I'm not evil enough to fit Kiri. I found that arguing with him is an exercise in futility," he stated. "And you are defecting as well?" she said, pointing to Sai with her finger. Tsunade couldn't have cared less at this point, but the boy continued, "Maybe I could defect to Naruto's cult. Miwa-sensei was kind enough to teach me to chant." "I don't know, is it possible to defect to your own village?" he asked. "You have a cult?" Naruto scrambled backwards, his arms failing about like the blades of a windmill, saying, "Don't blame me, it's all Taiki's fault." Doihara defended himself by saying, "I didn't do it on purpose," while appearing noticeably pale. "I didn't know he really was a Jinchuriki." Did the Jinchuriki have anything to do with this cult? What else could it be? Of course, Naruto did this kind of thing, transforming winter into summer. She might have sobbed when she saw the paperwork that would result from this if she hadn't been so proud of him. There was not enough money in the world, not enough alcohol, and she wasn't paid enough to deal with this, so she might still cry. Her apprentice jumped at Sasuke's neck as the door slammed open and she entered. Distraction. Well done, Kami. Yesterday, Naruto left her office. Naturally, Naruto already knew that was the reason they had initially traveled to Konoha. Kabuto had informed him. But he couldn't help but become enraged again. And Kyuubi was being a pain in the ass, licking him with his tongue of fire, as he has been doing lately. But this time, despite being completely awake, he could practically see it. Something red and orange appeared to be moving at the periphery of his vision, but as he turned his head, it vanished like water vanishing into parched sand. Additionally, he heard words, but they were barely audible. "Your precious Ruto is almost there, like the cries in storm winds. You think of Sage, Okage Red Wind, so red. I am proud of his description." Tsunade Bachan cried out, "You have a cult?" As if he had been balancing on a rope and now someone had shoved him with a crash. The voice and the red shadows vanished, leaving him at Tsunade Bashin's tender mercy, but her eyes glittered and her face was red as hell. The glittering was truly menacing. Too eager to shift the blame to Taiki, he begged, "Don't blame me, it's all Taiki's fault." At this point, Sakura-chan stormed in as the door was slammed open. Her hair, now a darker shade of pink, almost red, lay flat against her head, and she was drenched from head to toe. She had a filthy, dripping hem. Naruto still thought she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She gasped, "Sasuke-kun," and leapt for his throat. "I missed you so." Naruto grinned despite the fact that it was a little painful to see her swoon over her beloved Sasuke-kun. In a sense, he was the one who made her smile so attractively since he was the one who brought Sasuke back. Sakura-chan, however, stepped back and gave Sasuke a hard slap across the face. The sound of flesh hitting flesh reverberated throughout the room, and Naruto's mouth fell open. Sakura-chan's voice reached a pitch that Naruto had previously believed human throats couldn't handle. She punctured her tirade with one more slap before throwing her hands around Sasuke's neck once more. "How could you do that? Doesn't the word desertion mean anything to you? And you tried to kill Naruto? Don't try to tell me you didn't mean to. You put an A-rank assassination jutsu through his chest. Who does that to a teammate? He could have died. Anyone else would have. Have you no heart?" she said. "At least you are back now. You can make it better. That's good," she said. Although it was a rather abrupt change in mood, Naruto wasn't particularly upset either. "When the leaves fell, you didn't kick the trees. Instead, you urged them to try again the following year. Being friends was like the fall." In addition, Sasuke's face panicked like a mouse's when it was in front of a snake, which was hilarious. His two cheeks were glowing red from her blows, and he stood motionless and straight like an iron rod. A small chuckle from Naruto only served to draw Sakura-chan's attention to him. He stepped back now, suddenly uneasy because of the joy. She was clearly a little out of control, and you never knew what she might do. There was nothing he had done to merit a slap. She gathered him in an embrace and said solemnly, "Thank you, Naruto. You are a wonderful person and I'm so happy you are my teammate." It was his moment to remain motionless, his arms erect at his sides. He blinked quickly as his eyes stung. He really wasn't going to cry. He was so happy that he wouldn't have cared if she had slapped him at that moment because his heart was so warm and fluttering that it nearly hurt. He would have fought armies by himself, moved mountains, and done anything for her. "You." Sakura-chan abruptly shoved him away and swiveled to the side when Naruto noticed that she had turned to face Kabuto. He was perplexed and wondered if it was time for the slap. "Traitor!" she screamed, her fingers apart like the claws of a bird. "Hey, he's the one who brought Sasuke back to me. In that barrel too," he said, defending the morality of his friend. And, really, the barrel had been a nice touch. Hesitantly, she said, "Is that so? Then, thank you, I guess." She didn't appear pleased to thank Kabuto, but at least she didn't appear as prepared to severely disfigure him. Kabuto attempted to appear accommodative with a sheepish smile. When Sai asked, "Is she suffering from bipolar disorder? How she passed her psychological evaluation?" Sakura-chan then screamed in outrage once more. Tsunade Bachin muttered something like, "As heartwarming as this scene is, this really isn't the time and place for it," referring to the evils of the paperwork that was waiting for her. Naruto suggested, "Make Danzo do it when you catch him, he deserves it anyway," and smiled as the Hokage's eyes were illuminated by unholy light. The correct response was probably not this. She was rubbing her knuckles and smiling ominously. "I think I will, and I'll castrate Jiraiya for leaving you alone for whole 2 months." What was he thinking would happen? Since the participants weren't really essential to the conversation anyhow, Kabuto was the one who proposed moving the joyful reunion to the waiting area outside the office. Not being a moron, Naruto recalled that Kabuto believed he shouldn't hear or ask, but he didn't want to leave Sakura-chan or Sasuke at that moment, and if he needed to know, Tsunade Bachin would tell him anyhow. He gladly allowed himself to be herded out with Sai and his teammates. Naruto-sama can't find out he couldn't keep this from Sasuke, and he must not find out the Uchiha are never the most stable people from begin with. It's the strain improvident use of the Sharingan causes on the brain, Kabuto stated. Whispering, "Damn you, Danzo," Tsunade said. "Damn you to hell for this." Although they may have escaped the disaster thus far, they were unable to determine the exact number of people who were aware of it or their propensity to either reveal it or keep it a secret. They said that if 2 were dead, 3 could keep a secret. This skeleton would eventually claw its way out of the closet, and then there would be hell to pay. May Danzo rot in hell. Shin was the name of Sai's brother from a long time ago. He wasn't sure if Shin was his brother's given codename, his real name, or just a made-up name, but Shin was Shin, and in a display of life's great ironies, he called his adorable little brother Sai. The kanji used meant, to offer prayers, so even though it was written in a different kanji than Sai's codename, the irony still counts. Although they acknowledged that they knew nothing about their blood families, so there was a slim chance that Shin and Sai were related by blood, Shin maintained that genetics was not a prerequisite in the slightest. When Shin was alive, young Sai was willing to believe Shin's word for it, even though he had no idea what genetics meant together. They were always on a single mission. Sai had been blooded as part of the Root's desensitization program as a result of the mission, and the target was merely a merchant who had inadvertently hurt Konoha. Don't ask me what he did. Maybe he sells to Iwa too. Maybe he committed a tax fraud. It doesn't really matter anyway, Shin had stated to Sai. As a senior operative, he was present to witness the murder and make sure everything went according to plan. Sai recalled that the merchant had booked a room at an inn that, by chance, overlooked a precipitous cliff to a river that split the town in two on a lovely, sunny day. Although the river was only deep enough to reach a grown man's waist, it flowed quickly, the water was extremely cold, and, most importantly, the bottom of the river was covered in large, jagged rocks. Shin had sighed. Sai, it was supposed to look like a natural death. Sai was greatly perplexed by this remark. Isn't it natural to die if one falls out of the window into a river and is knocked unconscious underwater? He had inquired. Shin had moaned, taken his hand, and shunned them both away, saying, perhaps if the window had been open. Sai, whose name means rhinoceros, had betrayed Danzo at the last minute, as he had already been scheduled for a curse seal application, like all root ninja, and now it was raining. It had only been postponed by this mission, and Sai questioned whether the feeling of lightness in his chest was a psychosomatic sign of PTSD. Although he was fairly certain he wasn't traumatized, he couldn't be certain because no one had ever described what trauma felt like to him. Standing in the waiting area outside the Hokage's office, he watched as Sakura talked about her medical studies, Naruto talked about his travels with Jiraiya and great ramen bars, and their Junin sensei Kakashi, who was out of town on a mission, joined forces with Sasuke. They asked questions and mostly got one-syllable answers. Naruto appeared ready to explain, but Sasuke chose to volunteer a sentence instead. So Ero-sensei offended this Miko, and let me tell you, some of them can do seriously weird shit when they get angry, they said. He questioned, can't all women? Sakura merely threw back her head and laughed, but Naruto grimaced and turned to face her. She threatened, keep that in mind. I know where your tendons are, you know, but Naruto smiled and Sasuke seemed unconcerned. Can threats of violence be used as a form of bonding? Asked the man. Sasuke was sure he was missing some crucial detail, but Sakura and Sasuke turned to give him a look that was frustrated and disbelieving. Personhood. The art of being fully human. Read. Love is also a torrent of rain that falls freely, washing away the pains and chains of man's corrupt heart. And the heart reaches up to the heavens like saplings in need of water, and its cries for help shout out from there. Sai, whose name means offering prayers, threw a man out of a window on a sunny day. In the beginning, Sai was leaning back against a window. His name had changed, and it was now raining. It wasn't secured. Only if they know you don't really mean it, or if they know you mean it with love and stuff but don't get it mixed with masochism, though Sakura-chan probably suffers from that too, what with having a thing for the bastard. Following this, events transpired swiftly. Naruto should have been able to avoid Sakura's punch, but for some reason he chose not to. Sai could have avoided him when he was flung back towards him, but he wanted to capture Naruto. He succeeded, but the punch's force threw him backwards as well, shattering the window. Sai had just been flung out of a window, it was raining, and it was the end of one chapter in his life. It had nice symmetry, he said as he rolled over in midair. He even let out a little laugh. Naturally, he and Naruto were fine. They had a purpose for being ninja. Tsunade came up with a straightforward plan out of necessity because they were running out of time, and Danzo would lose the element of surprise the moment he learned that either Kabuto or Sai had returned to Konoha. And they desperately needed that surprise. Sai claims that, excluding himself, there were currently 20 children in the Root under the age of 16. 15 of them were younger than 12, and 5 of them were brand new recruits who were exactly 5 years old. Tsunade thought this was absolutely disgusting. It would be ugly if these children, who are only partially trained in the best situations, got in the way of her Anbu and Danzo's Junin fighting. It was to be a 3-pronged attack. Tsunade had instructed Danzo to come to her office to meet her after sending him a message regarding Uchiha Sasuke's return, which she was positive he no longer needed. An ambush awaited him there, and Shizune pretended to be Tsunade in order to entice the man inside. Hopefully, her student was able to deceive Danzo long enough for him to shut the door after him. Utatane Kaharu and Mitokado Homura were to be placed under house arrest as part of this operation. Tsunade wanted to think that Danzo's stolen Sharingan had just subtly controlled them, but she couldn't let them go free until everything had calmed down and they were officially exonerated of all charges. Operation Think About the Children, which Tsunade was personally spearheading, was the second prong Sai. And Kabuto. Damn, the creepy man Naruto had chosen to adopt like a stray puppy. Claims that although the root trainees' schedules varied according to their classes and skill level, they all ate at the same time in the same location in order to catch them in the trainee mess hall and begin ordering them around. It was intended to sneak in during dinner time and, hopefully, prevent a fight. Tsunade was personally required for this reason. Little Danzo did not like the fact that Tsunade was the village's current military dictator and that these kids had been raised to be fervently loyal to Konoha. Tsunade questioned whether even Danzo had gone so far as to criticize the Hokage's position, given that it was a position he had his sights set on, but there was no way of knowing if these child operatives would accept the established village hierarchy and obey her Junin. The kids were supposed to obey Tsunade like good little drones, provided that the Warhawk didn't give them contradictory instructions too. After Tsunade takes the kids out, or if and when the distress signal is given, the third prong would be the main attack on root headquarters. If everything went according to plan, the main force should be destroyed in an afternoon, but it would be a nightmare to find the agents who weren't in the headquarters, and it would likely take years to clean up the agents who were embedded in other villages should, once more. Tsunade was waving an umbrella and taking one last look at the map Sai had drawn for them. They were standing in front of the entrance to an old civilian shelter that had been abandoned due to structural damage sustained during the Kyuubi attack. Years had passed since it should have been demolished, but for some reason the matter had been lost in the administrative maze of the village government. She snarled, "Why am I not surprised?" and pressed the map against her cleavage. A moment later, only Sai was visible entering the shelter. "Sai, take point cat, behind me. You are responsible of the genjutsu, ASP. You advance on the ceiling, neutralize any guards we encounter silently." The shelter's above-ground portion was a solid, door-equipped gray cube. Everything was removed from the larger gray cubicle area below ground level, with the obvious exception of an entrance to a sewer that was disconnected from the main Konoha sewer system. Following a lengthy descent, 100 crouching, slender meters, and 2 twists, the sewer became incredibly roomy for a sewer. At this point, they encountered the first guard. It was a woman with short, mouse-brown hair, a mask on her face that showed a bird of some kind, and her hand on her Tonto's handle. The woman demanded in a toneless voice, ID and identification code. With an equally flat voice, Sai replied, "ID Route 522." A red hand hanging from a tree. A silent sentinel under the tree's roots, standing silent, loyal to the end. As a Hokage, Tsunade was expected to be familiar with all of the Konoha identification codes, but none of them were. The guard moved out of the way, but she stumbled back, her throat gaping. As she stepped over the body that Kat's genjutsu had quickly hidden from view, she was furious. Danzo's delusions were the only reason the woman had to die. Konoha was a village of unique snowflakes, and although propaganda tended to portray it as a pleasant place, the reality was that they promoted individuality as much as possible within the parameters of village loyalty. In life and limb, in blood and tears, and with numerous funerals to attend, Konoha could and would demand its tithe. But identity, the right to pursue one's own happiness in spite of the risks? No, Danzo had no. Correct. As they passed another guard and entered the trainee barrack division, fortunately, a low-level security area, she was furious. "There," Sai said, gesturing to a door that was closed, "there is likely at least one adult operative supervising." "Good," Tsunade said with a growl and a knuckle crack. She kicked the door open and said, "It's time to save my little snowflakes." In the Hokage's office, Kabuto and 5 Anbu waited in the tiny antechamber behind the secret door. He was aware that no one but Naruto-sama trusted him, but the Hokage was counting on his animosity toward Danzo to keep her shinobi safe in the middle of the fight. If he were to kill him, it would be one less headache for her. He knew that the woman liked Naruto-sama, which was fortunate given her unexpectedly vicious nature, but he would still need to watch her closely. Even a mouse could become a monster due to politics. He was aware as soon as Danzo entered the office the door didn't creak or click shut, and there wasn't a single sound of footsteps, but it was impossible to miss the hint of Uchiha in the man's chakra. They all behaved in unison. Sero positioned herself between Danzo and the window, while Sable avoided shining between the door and the exit. Now that Martin, Squirrel, and Crane had moved into a half-circle, Danzo was totally encircled. Kabuto just entered the office, and Danzo's head turned to face him when he finally stood in front of the man, prepared to defeat him. He felt not the least bit of the rage he had half expected to consume him. Rather, it seemed as though all of his blood had frozen into icy water that was so hot that it was burning inside of him. There was no happiness in the idea that he would murder Danzo. However, there was contentment. A feeling of completion prevailed. Danzo questioned, "What is the meaning of this, Shizune?" To be honest, they hadn't anticipated fooling them for very long. Shizune let her henge fade and got to her feet, causing the chair's legs to scrape the floor backwards. While Shizune went through the short list, Danzo stood in the ring of bared steel, apparently unaffected. You are under suspicion of several counts of unsolicited assassination, several counts of kidnapping of a Konoha citizen. Shizune said. No one relaxed an inch because he was an elderly, wrinkled, frail-looking man who was leaning on a cane. Shizune concluded her essay by saying, "Please surrender into our custody pending further investigation into your affairs." Kabuto suspected that it had to be said, if only for formality's sake. So be it, then Daitapa. Kabuto was not at all fooled by Danzo's dejected head tilt. The Anbu and Shizune were blown away against the walls, with a bookcase nearly colliding with one of the Anbu and a desk toppling over Shizune with a crash, after he flitted his way through a series of seals that let the wind simply swirl around him. Kabuto hit Danzo too quickly for the man to dodge, and the blow landed cleanly and forcefully even though his opponent's body broke beneath his grasp and landed in a heap with his back twisted at an odd angle. Kabuto knew it had been far too simple. Martin was stupid enough to demonstrate this by jumping to the old counselor's side and striking his chest with a lightning-fast wind jutsu, causing him to fall to the ground bleeding. Fighting in confined quarters required a unique set of skills. Kabuto moved aside to watch as Shizune bravely charged into the midst of the chaos, pulled the severely wounded man to the meager safety of the antechamber, and started to tend to him with her softly blue hands. The office and antechamber formed an entire space that was impossible to shun away from, and the heavily fortified walls withstand the tail end of the jutsu strikes that tore up flesh and furniture and soaked the floor despite dealing the most damage during the battle. Danzo was unable to complete his opponent. He was in his later years. What an uncomfortable age that must be now. If you'd asked my advice, I'd have told to stay 25, but it's much too late now. He laughed. The water, which was now ankle deep, was a delicate, translucent pink. Danzo ducked a blow from Crane's Tonto and replied dryly, "One can hardly stay 25 their whole life, unless they sink to Orochimaru's levels. Or yours." As it was implied, a sincere grin of amusement stretched across Kabuto's lips. Kabuto asked, "Stealing a whole body is wrong, but stealing eyes is all right? Do your morals operate on a weight-based system?" Danzo only froze for the smallest of seconds before avoiding a fire jutsu that left the walls smoldering and tugged at the bandages covering the right side of his face, confirming his suspicion that he was more exhausted than he looked. Bloodline theft had not been on the short list, and Kabuto questioned whether the man still believed he could get away with it all and stay in Konoha. And without further ado, he jumped back into the fray. Besides, one perhaps can't help growing older, but two can. With proper assistance you could have ceased at 25. Well, better late than never, I suppose. This partially reverse-engineered jutsu was a feint. A trick. He took Danzo's left hand and sealed it with both hands in one motion. Danzo was good, old or young Sero, whose face was now exposed by her broken mask, released wind-infused chakra onto her Tonto to make it longer and more lethal as a snake slithered out from beneath Kabuto's sleeve. Kabuto was forced to fall to his knees on the damp floor as Danzo spun both of their bodies around. As Kabuto's snake sank its teeth into both of their arms, Sero and Squirrel both struck, and Danzo simultaneously released bursts of wind blades that were too close for either of them to avoid. Then a number of things occurred simultaneously. Their bloodstream was exposed to the poison to which Kabuto was immune and which Danzo could probably neutralize as well. Red and black spots danced across Kabuto's vision as the wind blades pierced his flesh, causing him to groan in pain. However, when he sent a lightning chakra blast through the snake's body, this was the moment when he altered Anko's jutsu. The sight of Danzo being physically thrown by the lightning bolt sent a shockwave through Kabuto, who had been unfamiliar with euphoria for as long as he could remember. Danzo struck the window that was closed, but the walls would have easily survived the impact. Tsunade kicked the door open without any effort because it was unlocked. Standing seemingly alone in the doorway, with Sai concealed behind her form, the heads of everyone in the mess hall turned to face her under the harsh, yellow light of the light bulb without a lampshade. The children were dressed in similar plain clothes in dark blue and black. The place was a mirthless one, with bare gray walls, plain long tables without tablecloths, and plain long benches. There were also no carpets on the bare gray floor. Tsunade knew in the back of her mind that her desire to kill echoed through the room like thunder. It was unacceptable that she was so out of control, but perhaps it was still appropriate after all. Didn't thunder always follow lightning, and wasn't this whole mess the literal lightning from the clear sky? A man was present in the space, although he was not wearing a mask. His face was so blank that not much changed as he glanced at Tsunade. In the interval between two heartbeats he was swift, silent, strong, ruthless, and on par with Anbu. He was so outmatched that it wasn't even enjoyable to avoid giving the kids a little shock. Tsunade struck quickly and without blood, and the man fell to the ground with a slight moan. She sighed miserably and shook her head. "These rash youngsters," she said. "They don't make insurgents like they used to back when we fought in rain." The kids leapt to their feet, brandishing short swords like wakizashi and kunai, with the youngest one grabbing a shuriken and the rest of them positioning themselves to leap. Her Tsunade's smirk had to be concealed. They lacked any survival instincts, were utterly brazen, and had a little fire. Perhaps they weren't all that different from other students after all. "I am Godem Hokage Senju Tsunade, and that man was a traitor to Konoha," she roared. "Stand down and lower your weapons." Soldiers, 20 kids froze for a moment, some of them almost hiding their hesitation on their faces. "She is the Hokage. I have seen a picture of her," a boy with brown hair who was older than the others said. All of the children immediately bowed deeply to her and concealed their swords and kunai. They chanted, "Hokage-sama," like a spooky underground choir. Not a single one of them inquired. Tsunade told them, "We are fighting traitors to Konoha now." At this point, there was no need to inform the root forces that they were the traitors. Her words were greeted with thoughtful silence. "You are to follow me and my men above ground. Don't engage in battle unless directly ordered. I declare you ameliorated." With the smallest strain in his voice, the same boy who had recognized her said, "But Hokage-sama, there aren't any windows we could be thrown out of. Is this why we are going to the upper levels?" Tsunade blinked. "No, that's defenestrate. She means something else." Correcting the boy was a slender, doe-eyed girl. At her words, the tension barely subsided, and Tsunade discovered, much to her dismay, that the children had actually believed she intended to throw them out of a window. From the center of the crowd came the bell-clear voice of a small, androgynous child who said, "I thought defenestrating meant gelding." Another child responded, "No, that's castrating and it doesn't count as a natural cause of death even if they are drunk. Except if the dead person is Jiraiya-sama." Hair Senpai said so, but she didn't explain why. The girl said, "Wasn't that sabotage?" The child with the silver voice bit his bottom lip and pondered, "That too, I guess, if they have a really important keke genkai. But vitiating means sabotaging, looking ridiculously adorable and precocious, completely unsettling, too." Before it got out of control, Tsunade broke up the word of the day calendar recital. To ameliorate means making something or someone better now. "Make a crocodile, follow me, and don't make any noise," she said. She mentally noted that she needed to schedule multiple therapy sessions because, if kids who were too young to attend the academy were considering castration as a potential sabotage tactic. The kids weren't moving at all. The boy who had raised his voice asked her, "Do you mean an area effect genjutsu, Hokage-sama? Or should we henge ourselves as crocodiles? The youngest haven't been taught either yet. Just form pairs, grab each other's hands and follow me," Tsunade yelled, painfully aware that they could be found at any moment and that the clock was running out of seconds. Then, as if the world were making fun of her, a tremendous boom echoes off the walls and shakes the floor beneath their feet like an underground thunderstorm. What had taken place? The attack wasn't supposed to begin before her group left, and they hadn't sent the distress signal. She vowed to do some defenestrating unless there were some truly mitigating circumstances, with castrating being a very real possibility, and she herded the children out of the mess hall with the assistance of Cat and Sai, while Asp stood guard in a junction of tunnels. Although the winter had been pleasant and mild thus far, the strong wind and the clouds gathering southeast of Iwa indicated that a storm was imminent and that it would be a significant one. Walking home from the mission office at midnight, Deidara was exhausted, irritated, and dusty from the road. He hoped Tomomi hadn't been sent on a mission by himself while he was chasing an informant halfway across the nation. He was constantly concerned, even though it wasn't because she didn't know how to care for herself. What if a client misrepresented the parameters of the mission? What would happen if things just changed against you? Deidara was aware that not many plans made it through enemy contact and that any stray missing nin could cause trouble. Not because he didn't think Tomomi could care for herself, but in the unlikely event that something were to happen to her. He made his way up to Tomomi's house through the nearly deserted streets. Tomomi's house was one of the higher ones in Iwagakure no Sato, which was situated in a bowl-shaped valley encircled by sheer cliff faces and rock formations. Although it was not an apartment, it was a real house with a handkerchief-sized garden. It was long and narrow, with a kitchen that, according to Tomomi, was dangerous for head injuries if even one cabinet door was left open, and a bathroom where sitting on the toilet required pushing the knees into the shower. She was able to pay for it with the Chunin wages because of this. Somehow, the time was never right. Even though he had considered asking her to move in with him, she had a bad day, or one of her friends had recently lost a spouse, and he always lost his composure at the last second. Unless someone interrupted them at a crucial moment, he was resolute, though, and a ninja's life was brief and dangerous. He would ask her today. It was too late when Deidara returned. He found the clay statue he had created for Tomomi in pieces on the floor of the living room, along with bloodstains on the floor. "Tomomi," he muttered, an icy grip gripping his heart, desperation tingling his tongue with numb incredulity and despair. She should have been safe in the village. He thought as he wandered around the apartment like he was in a bad dream. Through the kitchen, through the living room, and into the bedroom. The window of the bedroom was open, however. Tomomi hadn't left on her own initiative, had she? No ninja worth their first shuriken would leave a window open leaning over the window sill. Deidara observed the lengthy drop to the lower levels of the village and pondered how simple it would be to die here. There was a bloody handprint on the sill. However, Tomomi had stated that suicide was not a solution. Wimpy defeatist attitudes were not tolerated in her home. She had stated he was unable to leap from her window. However, his foot struck something and sent it clattering across the floor as he stepped back. Deidara had to get down on her knees to locate the small item, a piece of ceramic armor. Because the house was dark, the thin, bone-white sliver had a reddish-brown stain and a bright red line that curved ever so slightly. Yes, there was the end of a red line in the corner of that curved piece of ceramic, but he had to fumble for a light to be sure it was a mask fragment. There was blood on the floor. Tomomi was nowhere to be found, and it was a piece of a mask. Deidara was unable to recall how he stumbled back into the living room, but he did manage to send a piece of clay clattering across the floor after his foot struck it. He remembered as the drum beat and the noise reverberated in his ears, and he continued to stare. As the broken statue of a dove filled his entire field of vision, a part of him was thinking about the practicalities, the inner sanctuary, the Tsuchikage's private library, and the classified section of the mission archives. Tomomi's statement that suicide was not an answer was finally understood by another part of the population. As usual, she had been right. His parents had recoiled from his early, unsettling inquiries, and he had just lost the only person who had ever understood him. Although it wasn't fair, he wasn't searching for either justice or death, at least not for himself. He grinned as he gazed at the shattered work of art on the ground. "I will be a good shinobi for you, Tomomi-chan. I will find out who is responsible." And then, fairness wasn't what he was after. All he wanted was someone to blame and then blast away. Art is a blast. The assembly and the council proper were the two councils in Konoha. Although the Hokage was the village's military dictator and, in theory, had final say over everything, in reality, he or she had to listen to the other authorities, if only to keep the cogs turning and prevent the village from becoming Kumo or, heaven forbid, Kiri. The Hokage's chosen advisors made up the council proper, which was frequently consulted on village issues despite not being a formal member of the council. Danzo had been an odd middleman who frequently attended its meetings. However, Danzo was the problem at the moment, and the council proper was under house arrest. Hopefully only until they were proven innocent. Tsunade convened the assembly the day following the second dissolution of the Root. The assembly's membership was more diverse than that of the council proper. It typically included the main clan leaders, ninja with important positions, and representatives of the civilian authorities when the issues involved trade and other civilian affairs. Generally speaking, everyone who needed to be heard would participate. Only the leaders of the Hyuga, Nara, Yamanaka, Akamichi, Aburame, and Inazuka clans, as well as Morino Ibiki in his role as head of the torture and interrogation, were present in this case because Danzo and the Root's case was purely military in nature and classified 7 ways to Sunday. Order in the council room. Tsunade interrupted Tsume's argument with Hiyashi and Shibi's conjecture regarding Sasuke's return and the reports that Danzo and Shikaku had fallen from the Hokage's window, striking the table hard enough to cause a crack. "Gentleman and lady and Ibiki." As his name was called, Ibiki nodded his head in her direction, his scars stretching as his lips twitched. "I know there are a lot of rumors going around the village about what happened yesterday, and I called you here to confirm a few of them. This is true. Uzumaki Naruto brought Uchiha Sasuke back to the village, along with a defector from Oto and another from Kiri." Tsunade felt a little bad about omitting Tsubaki's name from this first announcement, but Tsubaki was already a Junin, and although ninja were supposed to be immune to the effects of first impressions, well, with the possible exception of Hyuga Hiyashi, who Tsunade was positive had turned into the anthropomorphic embodiment of stuffiness after the late Uchiha Fugaku had left the post open postmortem, they were only human when these people thought of the return of the Uchiha. She wanted them to think of Naruto. "Good boy," Tsume exclaimed, his laugh wild, barking, and throaty. Her good humor, however, was short-lived. Shuza made a distressed noise and whitened her knuckles as she growled. "I hope you are belling that cat good and proper, Tsunade. My son came back from that rescue mission bleeding and he wasn't even the one hurt badly. It was only when Shikamaru gave Tsunade access to the Nara clan's medical book, something that had never been done before, that his son's life was saved." Knowing that was an argument best left for another time, she refrained from commenting. This is also true. Danzo has been found guilty of several counts of high treason and many lesser offenses. The Root has been disbanded the second time and he died yesterday resisting arrest. Counselors Mitokado and Utatane are under house arrest pending the results of the investigation into their actions. Tsunade declared instead as the voices were raised in protests, questions, and general shock. She realized that nothing short of Kyuubi's second coming would bring order to this chaos for a very long time. As much as Tsunade would have liked to blame Kabuto for defying her orders, the reports of her Anbu made it clear that Danzo had not shown any signs of intending to surrender and had actually been on the offensive for a significant portion of the fight. Tsunade had wanted Danzo taken in alive if at all possible. A long life of molding chakra made even an old body sturdy like that. He had survived the initial electrocution and the fall off the tower with a broken ulna, 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and a few third-degree burns on his arm. However, he was ultimately unable to withstand the poison of the snake technique that Kabuto had reverse-engineered from Anko, and Shizun's attempts to save his life had ultimately been unsuccessful. Perhaps, however, it was for the best. There's a reason the proverb, "A clan divided not standing firm," has endured over the ages. To be sure, Danzo wasn't solely to blame for the Uchiha would-be uprising, but that wasn't here or there, nor were the Hyuga going to acknowledge it. Uchiha Fugaku was a skilled shinobi, but he wasn't a good politician, and his clan was well positioned in the political sphere because he wouldn't compromise on anything. Despite the fact that many shinobi had to undertake such a mission, that condoms occasionally broke or malfunctioned, and that teenagers weren't always, or ever, the most responsible individuals, even in the most respectable clans, the entire clan had been so arrogant that they refused to acknowledge the possibility of a bastard Sharingan holder. Furthermore, nobody coerced them into plotting against the village by pulling their proverbial arm behind their back. However, Danzo's doorstep was the source of the rumors that the Uchiha were responsible for the Kyuubi attack. Fugaku's unwillingness to make concessions was undoubtedly exploited by Danzo, who insisted that the clan accept this, that, and the other restriction in order to prove their loyalty, before attempting to erode the confidence of the other clans with each rejection. After forcing the Uchiha to live in the compound and stand side by side, he accused them of being secularists. The Uchiha were nearly as much of an outcast as Naruto by the end of his witch hunt, and that was saying something. Tsunade was unable to determine whether Danzo's intentions were less selfless or whether he had genuinely believed the Uchiha posed a threat and turned what had been an ally into an enemy. His body's autopsy had undoubtedly revealed a lot. Perhaps the man's permanent absence, without the opportunity to escape his deserts, was for the best by causing division and causing rifts among fellow soldiers. He had been the one to mend Konoha's long-standing brokenness. Naruto was fixed where Danzo had broken him, and when, not if, but when, Sasuke eventually found out and everything broke again, perhaps, just possibly, he could make things right again. The group was confined to the Uchiha compound the day following Sasuke's return to Konoha and the fight against the Root. A number of Anbu kept a close eye on them to ensure that everyone complied with their orders. Tsunade was concerned that Sasuke might change his mind at the last minute and flee before his hearing, which is why she did this in his case. In Kabuto's case, the limitations were more about what he could do in Konoha if left unchecked than they were about his potential to flee, given that he had the best record with the two and that Tsunade blamed him for at least half of the mess. Naruto was told to stay there and watch over them. Sai and Taiki were included in the deal because, as recent defectors, they also needed to be closely monitored. Tsubaki was given that responsibility as an unofficial punishment for her failure to monitor and control Naruto. A brief trip to the compound and an account book to the forehead were the results of her mildly pointing out that perhaps that wasn't the best recommendation she could have for a job like this, although it would have required significantly greater numbers and a brutal fight to keep her out. Sakura wasn't really required to remain with the others. With a fish cake on top, Naruto had asked Kabuto to watch over Sai and prevent him from bothering the Anbu. While Taiki was busy teaching Tsubaki a combination of sword strike and water jutsu, the cheerful blue sky was now darkened by just one cloud. AD rank, moaned Sasuke. They made me AD rank. Naruto grimaced when he considered the mission ranking that had been assigned to his charges and those of Tsubaki-chan. Since he was essentially getting paid for hanging out with his friends, he reasoned that he couldn't complain, even though he was certain that it was just an additional punishment for the great sin of generating more paperwork for the Hokage-sama. What was he thinking? I think they are snubbing me, actually. Then he corrected himself. Never mind, it's obviously all about you. They were all cleaning Sasuke's old house in the great living room after the jerk fled with Orochimaru. A group of ferocious dust bunnies took over, fortified their positions, and began waging siege warfare against the resettlers, leaving it abandoned as of right now. Sakura-chan's more attractive cleaning clothes, which are a little small and worn, as well as 7 cleaning rags have been lost. Sakura-chan gently reprimanded the boys, saying, now, boys, there is plenty of blame to share, while swinging her duster loftily at a trench behind a bookcase. It's clearly both of you. A very familiar voice said, Ma, it's good to see you all so lively, from behind them. Surprised, they all leapt and spun around quickly. A very familiar figure was slouching in the doorway with an orange book that looked very familiar in his hand. Kakashi-sensei's words were soft and lazy, but when he entered, Naruto had the impression that someone had dropped a full crate of something very heavy on a mattress that was extremely soft and yieldy. To think I returned from a mission to find that the lost boy has found his way back home at last. The sudden intensity in the air seemed to dip the entire room, and he felt compelled to say something, anything, to lighten the mood. He was quick to joke. Sasuke's been demoted to D rank. Before he could catch his breath, fortunately, he was fast enough to avoid the blow that Sasuke also threw at him. Sasuke snarled, I'm going to kill you, but instead of leaping at Naruto, he hid behind Kakashi-sensei's back to be safe and spit out his tongue at him. He teasingly said, Naya. To his teammate Sasuke's expression was one of utter incredulity. Naruto's founded a cult, Sakura-chan, leaning against the wall, added in a sing-song tattletale voice. Naruto thought it was a great shame and a crime that she tried to conceal her incredibly beautiful smile behind her hand. But Sakura-chan's learned a heart-exploding jutsu from Kabuto, he responded. Taiki was really to blame for the cult, Kabuto added as he entered the room in preparation for a sudden movement. Kakashi-sensei slightly stiffened and shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. Kabuto simply gave a charming smile. Taiki walked in behind Kabuto and protested, I just prevented Naruto from becoming a Yakuza. Tsubaki and Sai trailed behind, packing the room to capacity. Fortunately, Sai was too absorbed in observing them as if they were all engaged in some horribly fascinating activity to speak. Kakashi-sensei's raised eyebrow turned to face Naruto, who protested, that was half Tsubaki-chan's fault. That eyebrow's ability to speak was unsettling. Tsubaki-chan sneered, but Naruto started it, what a traitor, she won't have any apple dumplings. Well, Kakashi's mouth drew lead, and his lone eyebrow perceptibly questioned when, in some way, being Naruto had become a socially transmitted illness. Naruto was quite pleased that he had been able to inspire it, and it even had a wonderful sarcastic tone. I see you are having a great time regressing to academy students. Naruto shushed him, and Sakura-chan laughed. Don't tell Tsunade-bachan we are supposed to be suffering as much as she is. He said. Something deep within him finally relaxed as a result. It had been knotted up for so long that he had lost sight of it. Sakura-chan was laughing. Kakashi-sensei was present, and Sasuke Teme had returned. Kabuto had returned. His team was finally fixed. He had made a lot of new friends, and everything was good again. Although Sakura had learned that heart-exploding medical jutsu from Kabuto, she didn't particularly like or trust him. This was done for a reason. She was working toward the future. Sakura was the only member of Team 7 who had a chance at normalcy, for whatever normalcy a kunoichi's life could have. Because he was holding Kyuubi and the Akatsuki was pursuing him, Naruto was doomed from birth. From the moment Itachi lost his mind and killed his entire clan, Sasuke was doomed. He had to find a way to exact revenge even though Itachi was, well, Itachi, and he was being pursued by jerks like Orochimaru because he was the last Sharingan holder unless Itachi counted. And Itachi once more. If someone had chosen to pursue that man while Sasuke was still a possibility, Sakura would have been shocked. However, Sakura had the opportunity to live a reasonably straightforward life with a long lifespan with a few competent genjutsu to use against her adversaries. She could develop chunin and become a skilled field medic. She could retire from active duty to raise children after getting married to Sasuke or another person. It would be sufficiently respectable. She said, please teach me, Kabuto-sensei. Bowing to the man as a good student would. Although she didn't trust him and didn't like him, she believed Naruto could straighten out even the most deranged mind on the planet. Kabuto said, aren't you already Godime's student, Sakura-chan? Why come to me? But Sakura sensed that he was weighing her more than he was rejecting her. The darkest, sharpest shadows are cast by the brightest light. Sakura's smile lit up the fading courtyard as she thought of Sasuke-kun and Naruto. Nara would have been proud of the shadow she cast behind her. Tsunade Shisho's the best medic in the world and she could beat you in a fight, hands down, but she wouldn't. I want to learn to fight dirty. I want to learn to take down someone leagues above myself by doing something totally underhanded. Please, at least give me pointers on what kind of techniques I should develop. Sakura had standards, so she would never do anything too evil, like that horrifying Edo Tensei technique, for instance. However, she lacked Naruto's peculiar charm and Biju, which appeared to be weaponized as an unholy bastard offspring of mind control jutsu and therapy. She had no innate genius or even keke genkai, she was just a smart girl who had good chakra control to compensate for her naturally low chakra reserves. She was just a girl with two teammates who were anything but normal, and a chance to be normal. Haruno Sakura was making a well-informed choice. Screw normal, she was terrified, but those who deserted their teammates were as bad as garbage. She would eventually face Itachi, Kisame, or other shinobi of her level in the fields, and they would never recognize her. Eventually, Naruto was able to pull Kakashi-sensei from the house. It was difficult because he insisted on supervising the house's cleaning, which Naruto was certain was a pretext to look at Sasuke, confirm that he was indeed there, and keep an eye on him. Now that it was dark and everyone had either gone to sleep or at least gone to bed for the night, Naruto had an opportunity to share his version of events without the peanut gallery's needless remarks about using food to lure the unsuspecting into his free love hippie commune cult. Thank you, not Sai, alright. Perhaps he had somewhat missed Kakashi-sensei, but only a little, and certainly not in the manner that he was consistently late for everything. He laughed and leaned back on the porch, saying, "Hey, you were late again. Everything's already over," to which he pointed at night. The Uchiha compound was actually very dark and eerily silent. While the Uchiha compound was not encircled by walls, it could have easily been its own small village within Konoha. In contrast, the rest of Konoha was always illuminated by streetlights, with people strolling the streets, shinobi returning from their night shifts, and vendors moving their wares when most people were asleep. An abandoned village. There was this mayor in the Iron Country that had a really bad spider problem in the town hall, and he asked me to sweep the webs away for him, explained Kakashi-sensei. His legs were hanging over the side as he sat on the porch railing. So what is this I keep hearing about your cult? It's not my fault. At first, it was just Taiki using this as an excuse to stay in T-Country longer so he could defect, and he didn't know I'm a Jinchuriki. Then Miwa-chan heard about it and she got all excited, and the last I checked, she was making Yondaime and Shodem Saints too, and making up a lot of profound sounding proverbs, and I swear there is no free love involved, period. Naruto was flailing about, swinging his arms about, when he noticed that Kakashi-sensei was staring him in the face. The heavy feeling he had experienced when he had first greeted Sasuke Teme was back there. As Naruto struggled to think of another thing to say, the weight suddenly disappeared. Proverbs, huh? How about this? It is the spirit that walks a person through darkness. He smiled. Naruto let out a moan. It would be typical of Kakashi-sensei to join in on the cult idea just to watch Tsunade Bachan blame Naruto for everything and do that I laugh thing. Kakashi-sensei, stop collaborating. She's bad enough as she is, and should you even be encouraging this anyway? In any case, why had he missed the Ero-sensei Jr.? When Ero-sensei the first was putting him through dodge training, he must have struck his head too many times. All Biju are black in darkness. The hippopotamus is hidden in the darkness, continued Kakashi-sensei without shame. Naruto groaned. What those even mean? In his time of need, the cruel sensei made fun of him by saying, "Next you are going to say something about the sound of one hand clapping in the dark," to teach Kakashi-sensei. Check to see if he received any dumplings as well, and don't give him ramen. Then, in front of Naruto, Kakashi-sensei did something he had never done before. He chuckled. Despite being a very common sound, it had a rather eerie quality. They didn't hear the half snort of amusement when he, Sakura-chan, and Sasuke did something foolish, or the typical perverted giggle they hear when Kakashi-sensei gets to a dirty joke in his ubiquitous books. Naruto could have done without knowing about those. Damn cheap-ass Jiraiya-sensei for not getting a real proofreader. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that people make, and Naruto felt compelled to avoid making abrupt movements, to make soothing, low-pitched shushing noises, and to slowly retreat. Kakashi-sensei pondered and shook his head, asking, "So sensei is a saint now? That's one cult I can get behind of?" Kenji was Jiraiya's name, and Iwa. His build was slender, his hair was short and dark, and his vivacious personality was barely noticeable. Kenji evoked, if nothing else, the serious, industrious Orochimaru of those bygone eras when the Sannin were still young, unbeatable, and united on the sides of right and wrong. His build had been taken care of by a special Akamichi pill, but it was always a bitch to gain the muscle mass back afterwards. Cutting and growing hair was also simple, but his best disguise was to shed Jiraiya in the same way that a snake would shed its too small skin. He was being sentimental, damn it. He did that when he thought about Naruto and his misbehaving teammate, but at the moment, he had no choice but to stay in the rented house and stare at a wall while reflecting. His bed was currently occupied by a sleeping beauty who took care of that. The previous evening, while returning from the covert meeting he had observed between Kakuzu and an Iwa representative, he had chanced upon her. He had nearly stumbled over the girl's legs leaning against a filthy wall while taking a shortcut through an alley between a shoemaker's shop and a blacksmith's forge. Considering her condition, she had performed a surprisingly good concealing genjutsu. He initially thought she had chosen a stupid spot to drink, and then he thought, oh shush tea. Jiraiya assumed she was attractive enough in the sense of the girl next door. Her skin was white like a woman experiencing severe blood loss. Her lips were red from her own blood, and her hair had been dark in the alley's shadows. She had opened her eyes and seen Jiraiya when he had been momentarily paralyzed by indecision. That was pretty startling. What good was a sundial in a shade? Jiraiya made no effort to downplay his many talents. However, he had the ability to conceal his skills, blend in with the background, and become as unimportant as a mass-produced clay pot. When infiltrating a hidden village, Jiraiya never used genjutsu or henge if he could avoid it. There were always chakra techniques, jutsu, and hidden seals in all significant buildings. All ninja had good eyes and a healthy dose of professional paranoia, or they were soon dead ninja. Byakugan was only found in Konoha, unless those unverified rumors about one Junin in Kiri turned out to be true. Tsunade Haim claimed that the time spent in geisha houses was a waste of time because he would use pills to lose muscle mass, cut and dye his hair, and apply makeup to cover his tattoos. Carefully making convincing physical changes wasn't easy, but those couldn't be carried out. However, the girl hadn't paid attention to his skin, hair, size, or even the attitude he gave off. Her eyes had glowed with recognition as she had examined the facial bone structure. Jiraiya of the Sannin good tell Deidara or heal bad things, she whispered as Jiraiya was about to finish her, and then she passed out right away. For that reason alone, he had taken her with him and dressed her wounds. Jiraiya had good instincts, but it didn't take a genius spy to realize that something was wrong when she discovered a woman in an alley, bleeding, talking about the much-discussed Tsuchikage candidate while wearing an Iwa headband, and delighted to see a Sannin in her village. She had hardly moved for more than 20 hours. If only she would wake up so he could start questioning her. Jiraiya said to her, "Don't you think it's time to wake up, lady?" The sky itself seemed to burst at this point. The boom was enormous, as if a mountain had split in two. It was more than just a sound. Jiraiya could feel the vibration at the roots of his teeth as the floor shook beneath his feet like thunderclaps. The echoes bounced off the stone walls and mountain faces outside in less than 3 seconds. Jiraiya was up on the roof and out of the window, and he was astounded by the sight that illuminated the Iwagakure night. A cloud of fine stone dust, burned yellow and reddish by the flames devouring it, had covered the Tsuchikage's tower. Even though the tea country was a far-off place, Kiri knew about Sato Naruto because of Taiki's report, and Orochimaru had taken his eyes off his experiments long enough to realize that Kabuto and Sasuke were still missing. Consider the consequences for a moment, and use no jutsu to turn the air blue for 30 minutes. Kiri was aware of the cult, Orochimaru was aware of Uzumaki and Jinchuriki, and the truth was that both locations were infiltrated by spies. Many influential people were now questioning Iwa because she had multiple infiltrators in Kiri. Taki and Kumo had each succeeded in putting a man in auto. Not the same man, as amusing as that may have been. And Konoha and Suna had spies in Kiri, Iwa, and Kumo, respectively. Sato Naruto was who? Intelligence officers in Konoha were pounding their heads against their desks, wondering how they were going to break the news to their superiors. The Kage's indifferent attitude toward the entire situation had the intelligence community in Suna in a frenzy. What was he thinking exactly? And why were these individuals referring to Jinchuriki as saints? Perhaps it implied something about Naruto that wasn't taken into account at this time in Konoha. When Princess Kazuhana Koyuki of the Snow Country heard about it, she briefly considered the surname before deciding that it was ninja to give a false name, that Naruto wasn't a very common name, and that given the messianic tendencies, what were the chances? She had to make one since there was no existing form for congratulating someone on starting a cult. The Wave Country's residents were unaware of what Jinchuriki meant, but since it was Naruto's nature to defend the world, it was clear that he was the one. Naturally, other people also heard. One was of Konoha and only formally a traitor, while the other two were of Konoha and officially deceased. The man who claimed that the Jinchuriki were saints, heroes, and deserving of adoration was told to the rain that cries with sorrow's orphans, and the others. Most of them weren't duped by Sato for a minute when they heard the name Naruto. The others, some confused, some amused, some pitying, and some simply afraid, would all ask the same question. Perhaps the wisest were the last ones mentioned. Who exactly was Sato Naruto? Those who were familiar with the name asked the same question, but the word, who, meant something different to them. Tsubaki had been released from the Uchiha compound and was en route to fulfill a promise the day after, as Naruto counted from the return to the village. On the streets, people stopped talking and heads turned to follow her, But now there was speculation rather than accusation. Curiosity rather than condemnation. Tsubaki knew what had overshadowed her previous relationship with Mizuki in the Konoha rumor mill without having to listen to the half-stifled whispers. Danzo, Uchiha, and Uzumaki. In actuality, every ninja was an unstoppable gossiper. Because shinobi disliked competition, curiosity killed the cat, nosiness was the other occupational disease spread by whisper infection, and intelligence was a matter of life and death. Petty gossip also made for good dry practice. Tsunade had succeeded in keeping the specifics of Sasuke's return, Danzo's demise, and Naruto and Kabuto's involvement in the incident hidden, but she was powerless to prevent the villagers from learning that the village's upper class had been upended and shaken to see what would fall off, and now everyone was curious about what. Hokage-sama had dueled Danzo in her own office. What had he done wrong? Some whispered that it hadn't been Hokage-sama, but Uzumaki. No, Yakushi. Yay, right, others said, like that traitor would even if he could win that fight. And what had Uzumaki done to bring Uchiha back? What was he doing in the village without Jiraiya? And what was Yakushi doing back there at all? She discovered that having the answers everyone was looking for and a valid reason, a valid order, to keep it a secret was incredibly fulfilling. Tsubaki ambushed the canary, raided the pantry for good measure, and pretended to be a cat that had gotten the cream while being scrutinized. When Tsubaki arrived at the tiny eatery, every stool in Ichiraku was occupied, but she wasn't there to eat. When she pushed the cloth with the kanji for raku to the side and slipped in, the men were watching her from the corner of their eyes, but the shinobi eating there weren't quite awkward enough to stop talking or turn to stare. Even though it wasn't 10 yet, Tsubaki decided to stay for a meal when Ichiraku Tuchi stood with his back to her, cooking something that tasted like ginger and prawns and made her tongue water. Yame, who was frying pork with one hand and boiling eggs with the other, saw her and smiled. She chirped, "Please wait just a moment, honorable customer," and removed the pan from the flames. She remarked, "No hurry, I'm just here to have a word with your father," which made Tuchi glance past him when he probably tried to recall when he had first met her and why she would want to speak with him. His brow was furrowed. "Good morning, Tsubaki," said the man seated beside her. They had never been exactly close friends, but she knew him by name as a Junin. She said, "Good morning, Yoshikazu," with a sun-like smile already. It looked like it would be a stunning day. "I haven't seen you for a while, Tsubaki. I take it you just returned from a mission?" He was fishing. Tsubaki thought, "You wouldn't see me before I left," but oddly, the thought didn't hurt her. All that was present was joyful expectation. Oh no, Naruto was truly infectious. She continued the moment of revelation by saying, "Well, yes, my last mission was to the Tea Country, as on-field support to Naruto. You see, taking a moment to get everyone's undivided attention, I joined a cult there." "A cult?" Yoshikazu repeated feebly, causing several men to pick their jaws up off the table. Tsubaki did her best to mimic one of Kabuto's more beautiful smiles. "Yes, we believe in purifying ourselves by obeying the light of truth so that we have sincere love for our brothers and sisters, the power of the human sacrifice that protects us from the evil of the Biju. World peace through superior firepower and biodynamic cultivation. Would you like to have a pamphlet?" Tsubaki was adept at concealing her inner thoughts and was a good kunoichi. It was all she could do not to laugh aloud when she saw the goldfish's eyes turn to her. She kept it all in, as if her ribs were cracking. At this point, Tuchi turned to face Tsubaki and brought 2 bowls to the counter. He gave Tsubaki the impression that he didn't trust a word she had just said by raising one eyebrow. Those were more like half-truths. Actually, Tsubaki joined because of the moral support, not because of the faith. At least she owed Naruto that much. "So what it was you wanted to talk about, Tsubaki-san?" Tuchi inquired. After saying, "I came to offer you my most sincere thanks," Tsubaki struck as swiftly as a snake. Crushing her mouth against Tuchi's, she took hold of his collar and dragged his upper body over the counter. There was no point in not going all the way out after all, so she took advantage of Tuchi's little, startled noise to give him a tongue slip. Tsubaki nibbled on his bottom lip one last time before letting him go, and he tasted like miso. She inhaled in his ear and then straightened. "Thank you for being there for Naruto," she said. A kunai could have broken the silence that had descended. She waved a little and said, "Have a nice day," to the stunned audience before stumbling off. Tsubaki snickered aloud as Ayame's voice drifted out after her, asking, "Dad, have you joined a cult?" Naturally, these things always took their time, but the preliminary inquiry revealed that Danzo, not collaborators, had deceived Mitokado Homura and Udatane Kaharu. This information delighted Tsunade. The trust in Danzo and his words and opinions, which they were unable to fully explain or rationalize when asked some pointed questions, had been encouraging despite the fact that the years had disillusioned them. However, replacing Danzo was going to be a nightmare because the man had been a traitor, but he had been a hard-working, bureaucratically inclined traitor, and it would be even worse if the two elders were forced to completely sideline him. Naturally, once the rest of the affairs were in order, she would be given a new council. No matter how innocent and useful Homura and Kaharu were, keeping them would only make her look weak. Although it was unfortunate that they had to retire, they were old and worn out and had been forced to hold their position for much longer than they should have because the next generation had not been able to find suitable replacements. It was similar to Sandame, who was actually too old for the position although he was physically strong. The job required more than just physical prowess. Sandame had been worn out. He passed away in the office where he had previously retired. Kaharu and Homura would at least be able to pass away peacefully. Even though this problem had been resolved, there were still a number of others to think about, including what to do with the Root's remains. The children simply could not be placed in any part of the system. They were subjected to torture and interrogation, had their chakra sealed to prevent them from performing a suicide jutsu, were gagged to prevent them from biting their tongue, and were under continual suicide watch because only 2 men had been taken alive in a fight. It was obvious what would happen to them. The rescued children presented a bit of a conundrum, but Sai was the only real defector, and his position was also fairly obvious. The task of deprogramming them and integrating them into the correct Konoha was proving to be especially challenging. They need a proper, home-like environment to acclimate to Konoha, Hiyashi stated. Sume grumbled, but not by the Hyuga. You are practically a cult, and Hishi's face flushed. When he retorted, at least we don't raise our children in a kennel, Sume yelled back that the Inuzuka at least didn't brand their own like cattle. On certain days, Tsunade sincerely hoped that the assembly had a single, communal neck around which she could put her hand. To Tsunade's surprise and delight, Naruto was then suggested by someone, and the concept received some hesitant support. Konoha, however, valued outcomes, and even before the boy had gone on to drag Tsunade back and now do the same to Sasuke and Kabuto, turning a visibly insane Jinchuriki around in the middle of an invasion had taken many by surprise. Nobody questioned Naruto's strategy's efficacy, but nobody truly understood it either. The fact that Naruto and Jiraiya were scheduled to depart Konoha once more at the exact moment that Tsunade's perverted teammate could be reached ultimately destroyed that plan. It simply would not be feasible to have such an entourage. What about Amino Uruka then? Isn't he the one practically raised Naruto? Shikaku inquired. Tsubaki came to mind instantly when Tsunade said, "The job is too big for one person, but we could assign him some help," was simply ideal given that he had turned down 2 Junin evaluations. Uruka didn't really deserve the headache, but he also seemed to enjoy dealing with pre-Genin Hellions. Now that they had 2 people, they needed a place that was sufficient in her opinion. As Hyuga Hinata looked at the ancient Uchiha compound, she was twitching her thumbs. Back in the village, somewhere, was her Naruto-kun, the hero who had rescued Sasuke and accomplished other things she had overheard her father mention in his conversations with her grandmother. Her heart was filled with warm bubbles that felt so real that she would have been afraid anyone of her blood could see them and see her happiness if they had just activated their Byakugan. She was so happy that people could finally see him the way she did. If she only had the courage to enter the compound, everything would be ideal. After all, the compound hadn't been officially designated off-limits, had it? All she wanted to know was how long it would be before Naruto had to leave the village again, when she might be allowed to go there, and when she might meet him. Perhaps she could just slip in and out quickly and that would be okay? Only to obtain the schedule. She muttered, Byakugan, and let her chakra move through the well-known channels through the negative of the compound's numerous walls and trees. 4 shapes of adult men and a woman were visible, glowing bright blue with powerful reserves and well-practiced pathways. 2 of them, however, were on the opposite side of the compound. Naturally, Naruto was also there, along with Sakura, Sasuke, a female Junin she recognized by appearance but not by name, and an unidentified man. There was Naruto, his special chakra tinted with deep buried red, making it glow purple and bubbling like hot spring water. It was radiating mental energy like heat from a campfire on a cold winter night. His golden hair, blue eyes, and contented, sunny tan were all lovely, but this was what she found so beautiful about him. The color of taste of burnt orange on ginger, mental component of his chakra, was so bright that she could see more of him than other people, and he was that much more open than anyone else. High-level Junin concealed their true nature, but Naruto was transparent and stunning, resembling a transparent gem that had been cut and polished somewhat haphazardly but was evidently perfect on the inside. Hinata was simply astounded to learn what he carried inside of him and how he remained that way. She had made a self-promise to be braver, a little braver each day until she was ready, but she would still have to go there and speak in front of everyone. Perhaps the time had arrived. Determined to get to Naruto, she crossed the street and squeezed through a narrow gap in the hedgerow between 2 houses. She had witnessed 2 Anbu observing 2 distinct individuals, one of whom was a young boy sitting beneath a tree and sketching something. The boy was stronger than Hinata, though he was a little too far away for Hinata to identify. The other man was taller and appeared familiar. A high-level shinobi was suggested by the way he was able to conceal a significant amount of his chakra. Even though the tenketsu was clearly visible even with this knowledge, she was taken aback when he appeared in front of her in a burst of green leaves and chakra. His posture was far too relaxed for the sudden response. It was Yakushi Kabuto exclaiming, "ICA came to, timetable Eep." Why was he back in Konoha, where he was with Naruto, when he had been Orochimaru's spy? Hinata-san, what might your business here be? He inquired. He asked softly, with your Byakugan activated, no less? Hinata quickly deactivated her bloodline, feeling a flush rise to his cheeks. Damn her treacherous tongue for betraying her in this way. When she last saw him, the Anbu had been hiding behind a corner, secretly watching the meeting. Ah, I see. Hinata-san, I am a medic nin and I see you suffer from amor herios. Physicians of the Sage of Six Paths time thought of it as a kind of melancholy, brought about by the humorous infection of the middle ventricle of the brain. Kabuto said with a voice that was mild and smooth. The medical term for the Hyuga's tendency to taste what they saw and hear sounds was synesthesia. A side effect of the Byakugan. Kabuto's voice was white with a steel-gray sheen around the edges, almost like a pearl. However, why had no one recognized her illness? The chakra displayed such things. Kabuto went on to say, the infection is caused by thinking continuously on the image of the loved one. As Hinata's voice was choked in her throat in the corners of her eye, the world grew darker. The words, "Hey, I mean," came out of her throat. As the silver-haired man went on ruthlessly, Hinata passed out. This will reach the point where it becomes almost impossible to think of anything else, he said. As he completed the requisition forms for the field trip, his class would be going on outside of Konoha in 2 weeks. Amino Uruka was humming contentedly. The forms only had to be returned 3 days prior to the event, but it was better safe than sorry given the additional paperwork the entire village administration would have to deal with in the backlog it would cause. It was impossible to replace in-village training with survival exercises. I was reminded of Naruto by that Naruto demonstrated during that class that although he might have trouble with many subjects, survival was not one of them when he spent a week camping in the forest. When the kids were instructed to catch fish for lunch, Naruto waded into the river and barehandedly grabbed fish from it. He had constructed a lovely shelter out of fallen branches, moss, and vines. Uruka believed it had greatly boosted Naruto's self-esteem, and other students had attempted to imitate the boy but had only ended up getting wet. His favorite pupil had returned to the village. Although Uruka was aware that teachers shouldn't have favorites, he had long since come to the conclusion that Naruto should have someone to support him because he was everyone else's least favorite. And Naruto had returned, accompanied by Sasuke. Uruka's smile expanded, but as he recalled that he still hadn't been given permission to meet Naruto, a shadow appeared. No, it wasn't just Sasuke. Elder Shimura Danzo was thrown from the Hokage's window and ended up dead. And Naruto was also involved in this in some way. However, he didn't worry too much because Hitaki Kakashi had confirmed that Naruto was okay. Additionally, he had Tsubaki-chan, an informant he was positive he could persuade to speak with him. She was back in the village too, and although she was technically not supposed to talk to him, he was confident he could use tactful references to friends sticking by one another through thick and thin to guilt-trip her into telling the truth. It was true that he was known as the nice one in Konoha. However, that did not imply that he was incapable of obtaining what he desired when the time came. Suzume-sensei moaned and stretched, popping her back in a way that sounded deliciously relieving. Back to the Little Hellions, she said. Target practice for the next 2 hours for you. Along with the majority of the academy sensei, they were seated in the teacher's lounge. Poor Hiroshi and Tsuneyuki were forced to watch recess, and nobody was jealous of them because it was nearly as exhausting as 2 hours of math at the very least. The coffee in the lounge was strong, black, and blazing hot coffee. Medical jutsu and paint remover were the 3 descending stages of coffee in the academy as it corroded his esophageal mucosa. Uruka took a large gulp from his cup and enjoyed the revitalizing burn. He was about to say, free period, and after that taijutsu. After that, when Tsubaki-chan entered the lounge through the open door, she looked much better than when she had left for that mission, and that was the first thing he noticed about her. The spring had returned to her steps, the tightness around her eyes had subsided, and a sincere smile had taken the place of the upward curve of her lips. He had been correct despite his ravenous appetite. Naruto was the best therapy and far less expensive than the private sector. Of course, there was the public sector, but in that context, the T&I ninjas were moonlighting, and even though everyone knew they were working for their customers. He greeted her, saying, "It's nice to see you, Tsubaki-chan. How have you been?" His fellow teachers' slightly covert glances at Tsubaki were unavoidable, and the conversations they were carrying on became sidetracked as they strained to hear this. He would have been upset with them, knowing full well how the rumors had affected her, but her smirk suddenly made him think of Naruto. The Naruto right before a smoke bomb went off or the toilets flooded. "I'm wonderful," she said, bringing herself closer to him until she was almost on his toes, "and you are wonderful too." She gave him a kiss. It was neither the close-mouthed, sweet, questioning, chaste kiss he would have expected from her if he had ever entertained the idea of Tsubaki proposing to him, nor was it a sisterly peck to the cheek like those Uruka had received from her before. There was a lot of nipping and sucking, and it ended far too soon. It made his eyes slide close, and even then, red spots danced in the darkness before them. It also made him dizzy, took his breath away, and made his fingertips tingle. It wasn't until he opened his eyes to look up at her that he realized Tsubaki had pushed him backwards over his desk. His ear was touched by those crimson lips. Tsubaki took to the window with these final words. "Thank you for being so good to Naruto. I wish I had been too." Before Uruka could even muster the mental strength to comprehend what she had said, much less get back up, she was gone. Uruka had no idea that Suzume's voice could reach an octave. "Are you lovers, Uruka?" she asked. Seeing that everyone in the lounge was staring at him made him flush even more than he already was. Beet red, blood red. "Ah, no," she was, "just happy. I did something for her." He tried. It was obvious from the collectively raised eyebrows that no one had been persuaded by the truth. Shoichi winked at him and drew lead. "So why was she kissing you then? That didn't look like simple gratitude. Could it be just really good afterglow?" Uruka sulked and put his face to his hands. "Please be your speculation to yourself. We are in school building," he said. Since that hadn't been a thank you kiss, he knew that it didn't really matter what he said at this point and that any remarks would only make the situation worse, and that was the exact reason Tsubaki-chan had done it. He would have wagered a sizable sum of money. The majority of ninja, or those who lived long enough, had a realization at one point in their lives that it didn't and shouldn't matter what total strangers thought of them because life was short, their kind lived quickly, and they probably wouldn't leave a very attractive body behind. If being a real shinobi was your goal in life, what did it matter that some people didn't think academy teachers were? What if the passerby cringed at the sight of the flames of youth in green spandex? Or, as Uruka reluctantly acknowledged, reading porn in public was meant to be embarrassing if you were a bad dodger. Sticks and stones could break your bones, but if you broke bones for a living, words seemed much less intimidating. Naruto had discovered this far earlier than anyone should have, and it appeared that he had imparted this knowledge to Tsubaki-chan, who was now savoring the newfound independence it provided. Well done, she. Well, she was sent out to assist Naruto and they came back with Sasuke, and isn't Uruka practically Naruto's dad anyway? Maybe they conspired together to give her a chance to kill the bastard who turned Mizuki? Two birds with one stone and all. But didn't Kabuto come back to the village alive? Do you think Mizuki might have suffered a sad accident in the prison? Everyone was going to ask him questions when he had lesson plans to create or quizzes to grade, and his colleagues were going to try to hit the why of the curious case of the sensei and the hot kiss for the next month. At the very least, the month was going to be extremely long. Naruto joyfully bounced up the stairs to Uruka's floor in the old apartment building that evening. He had been in the village for a long time without seeing his old teacher since Tsunabe Bachin had finally released them from quarantine, and he didn't want Uruka-sensei to think that he no longer respected him now that Ero-sensei had taken over. Even though he had to track Naruto down and drag him to the academy on ropes, Uruka-sensei had at least taught him consistently 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, even if he didn't know the really cool stuff. When he realized that Uruka-sensei truly cared and that it wasn't pleasant to avoid him, Naruto forced him to do that more than once a year. Uruka-sensei must have been concerned for him, so he thought for a moment before knocking on the door. Perhaps he should have brought Sasuke along. That's how Uruka-sensei was. He cared about everyone, especially the people he had taught. He had once attempted to explain to Sakura-chan that, "Your ass belongs to the village when you leave the academy, but your well-being is Uruka-sensei's." Sakura-chan yelled, "Don't say such crude things," and threw him a sandal. They had an issue where they conversed with one another in two different ways. Sakura-chan may have finally understood, though, because she always went to Uruka-sensei after a school spar without complaining that she was okay and let herself get properly fussed over after spraining her wrist or ankle in the next fight. Ino kicked Ami's ass to the curb, and Amy got fussed instead. That girl, Amy, or something, had called Sakura-chan a teacher's pet. He yelled, "Uruka-sensei, I'm back," and rapped on the door. He also had a key, which Uruka-sensei had given him after he had attempted to break in 17 times and ended up getting caught in his rope traps. However, he had also stated that it was extremely rude to just barge into someone's house without knocking if they were inside. He had practically writhed in embarrassment when Uruka-sensei grinned and assured him that he trusted Naruto with the key after Naruto had attempted to break in to play a practical joke on him. After all, he had never played a practical joke on Uruka-sensei at home. He kept that information at school. Hold on. As he opened the door, Uruka-sensei gently reprimanded Naruto, saying, "It's good to see you too, but you don't need to drop my paintings off the wall when you knock." For some reason, he appeared somewhat harried, but not Naruto harried. Rather, his expression was more strained and irritated. Naruto shook his head and said, "Uruka-sensei, what's happened to you?" He punctuated his outrage with a poke to Uruka-sensei's chest, saying, "Wait, that wasn't what I was going to ask. I mean, I want that answer too, but when you gave me the key it was a bringing me up right thing, wasn't it?" Uruka-sensei blinked and said, "It took you this long to notice? You came here to ask me that?" He gave his sensei his best puppy dog eyes and said, "No, that wasn't why I came either. Can we go to Ichiraku together? I have a lot to tell you." Naruto pouted when Uruka-sensei asked, "Was this really the reason, or will you remember something else you came here for?" He grumbled, "Now you are making fun of me. It is unfair. I can't help myself, you know, but I haven't pranked anyone since Jiraiya-sensei left me in Makima. I have been a responsible adult forever and a day." Inexplicably, Uruka-sensei said, "To be young enough for forever and a day to still happen." But Naruto hummed deep in his throat and closed his eyes as he ruffled his hair. It had been Uruka-sensei's proud moment. If it makes sense, Naruto was so happy about it that he wanted to writhe out of his skin. To answer your questions in order of inquiry, I have suddenly become a gossip item. Yes, I tricked you into behaving more maturely by showing you I trust you. That's called bringing you up, and we can go to Ichiraku. But maybe we should talk here inside instead. Much of what has happened is sensitive information after all. Now Uruka-sensei gave him a stern came to mind. Naruto rubbed his head and grinned slightly. "I have the clearance to know about everything you were going to tell me, right? Even about Danzo falling out of Hokage's window?" he asked. Since he probably shouldn't reveal Kabuto and Sai's secrets, he tried quickly, Hey, I kind of haven't asked." "Wait a second, Danzo's fallen out of a window. Who is Danzo?" He was going to share all of his own, but Kabuto and Sai ought to make that decision since he is capable of maturity. Uruka snorted and shook his head. He ruffled Naruto's hair once more, and everything was fine. "Only you, Naruto. Only you, and I would like to know how this all came to be. I have questions as well, and a lot more than you, I presume." Kabuto was initially taken aback when the Konoha assembly told him that he would be following Naruto back to Makima following the conclusion of the initial debriefing, which is a polite way of saying relatively polite interrogation. He was highly suspicious of the assembly's intentions because he would have assumed that he would be under extremely strict surveillance for the next 10 years or so. He was aware that, despite Godem Hokage's apparent faith in Naruto, the rest of the group was as untrusting as the ocean, and that letting him leave the village just a few days after the fact was blatantly obvious. His mind was clear, hard, and cold as ice these days, calm and clear-headed, undisturbed like a frozen lake. Already, he was mentally performing calculations. He was told by Yamanaka Inoichi, "We expect you will toe the line very carefully, Yakushi-san." Kabuto was careful to maintain a respectful, non-threatening, and submissive body language. His smile was what he referred to as his Omat smile. Similar to the no masks, it was appropriately upward curled and blank, exposing nothing and letting the viewer read and speculate as they pleased. "Do not betray us, oh thus, they employed this gambit." Senju Tsunade had a charming, enigmatic face. The powerful men and women in front of him were already regretting their mercy, so he said, "I will not make you regret your mercy," with a sense of comfort. Naturally, they weren't just allowing him to leave the village with Naruto-sama and whichever higher-ranking official had the authority to go with him to Makima in public. Probably not Tsubaki. Considering her obvious indulgence of Naruto-sama, they would be secretly followed by an Anbu team, or perhaps several, to see if Kabuto would hang himself using the provided rope. Every person in the council chamber was praying to whatever higher power they might believe in, and he was absolutely positive that he would. After all, they had all met Shimura Danzo, uncomfortably aware that the man must have had multiple skeletons in the clan closets. And Kabuto had already shown how much of Danzo's affairs he knew, though obviously not as well as they had thought. The best they could do was to give him the opportunity to desert, meet foreign agents in secret, or do anything else that could be used as an excuse, because Naruto-sama would not suffer if Kabuto was killed or imprisoned, and Tsunade would not suffer if Naruto-sama was betrayed. Kabuto was aware that Inazuku Sume had been against this, that she was far too straightforward and honest to keep any sinister secrets, and that her eyes sparkled like sharp flint fragments. Scarred Nara Shikaku seemed more irritated than anything, and Kabuto questioned whether his aversion to underhanded transactions stemmed from his laziness or from the fact that it would have been illogical to engage in them. However, the remaining ones all had faces that resembled windows with their internal shutters closed. Could Yakushi Kabuto divulge any embarrassing secrets? What if he decided to divulge his information during the in-depth interrogation, considering how thorough and willing he had been to do so thus far? What actions would the Konoha government be compelled to take? Or what if he should speak to Naruto, for heaven's sake? The village's unofficial but undeniably second most powerful man had already been killed as a result of the young Jinchuriki forcing the Hokage to face a situation. His declaration, "I will die Naruto-sama's," was both a threat and a pledge. Naruto-sama had not received much kindness from Konoha thus far, and past behavior was the best predictor of future behavior. What if Naruto-sama ever needed a weapon or edge to use against people he couldn't raise his hand to? Good blackmail lasted forever, even though steel broke and chakra ran low. Naruto and his group were making their way to the gates of Konoha. He thought it was kind of nice that Sasuke had joined them, and he was thrilled that Sakura-chan had chosen to come see him off since Kakashi-sensei was on time for the first time since Naruto had met him. He wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but at least he was still wearing that perverted book. Naruto would have feared a fresh invasion or something if he had abandoned that Tsunade Bachan winning at gambling was like Kakashi-sensei without porn. Without mentioning anyone in particular, he said, "I'm glad they let Kabuto come, but why can't they send Tsubaki-chan too? She's great. What was he going to do without her?" Tsunade Bachan had stated that she was needed because the assembly hoped she had picked up some tricks from him, which was kind of awesome. Tsubaki-chan, who mothered the team and was always there for anyone in need, was similar to Sakura-chan's older sister, and perhaps, just possibly, Naruto had occasionally pondered whether having Tsubaki-chan was similar to having his own mother or big sister, but she was too much of a friend to be a mother. It was hard to describe what Tsubaki-chan meant to him, but it would be terrible to leave her behind. "Take care of yourself and take care of Kabuto," Sakura-chan warned him. "He promised to teach me some tricks." For some reason, this caused Kakashi-sensei to falter, but Naruto nodded and assured him that both he and Kabuto would be alright. He never failed his pals. "And you would better not make Sakura-chan cry again," he said, pointing to Sasuke's nose with a finger. Sasuke's expression was one of utter incredulity, but Naruto had already discovered that something Itachi was also present. He nearly apologized, but Sasuke snorted and called him a fool, and everything was fine once more. When they arrived at the gates, Konoha was surrounded by low, heavy, and damp clouds. Tsubaki-chan and Taiki stood by Kabuto, who was waiting there with a folded red umbrella under her arm. Although she had no bags with her, Naruto briefly hoped that she would be joining him. Nevertheless, it was sufficient that she had come to bid him farewell. Naruto smiled as he bounced over to her. He confided in her, "Try to look after Sasuke too, okay? He really needs it." He easily sidestepped the blow that Sasuke threw at him, and since he didn't punch again, it wasn't like Sasuke was particularly upset. Brightened then, she muttered under her breath, "I will see what I can do, even though my list of people to look after. Uruka asked me to tell you he's sorry he couldn't come, but he has a class in session right now." It was one of the nice farewells when Naruto had last left Konoha. He had smiled and accepted it, but in reality, Sasuke had fled to join Orochimaru, and he had failed to keep his word to Sakura-chan. Although he had not given up, he had felt as though he was carrying the burden of all of Konoha up a hill in knee-deep mud and rain. He had been joyful and hopeful because he would have sobbed otherwise. Danzo had been overthrown. Kabuto had returned, and he was leaving the entire circus in capable hands now that Sasuke was back in Konoha. Sakura-chan's lovely smiles were even more beautiful because they were completely sincere. It was simply too good to stay that way. Naruto's life was filled with ends. There were those who insisted that theirs had a but. "Although my job is interesting and enjoyable, it pays little. Although she's very attractive and fun, her parents are scary and have a lot of exploding tags." Naruto had ends because he didn't think that kind of weak, defeatist mindset was appropriate. He was a strong believer in "Ensuna attacked us, and I kicked Gaara's ass. Now he's better and I don't have to wonder if I could have ended up like that. Sasuke fled, and I'm going to train with Jiraiya-sensei. It can be fixed." As he turned to face Maeda Guy in his green spandex glory, Naruto froze and said, "Greetings, my eternal rival. It is my honor to inform you that I have been chosen to accompany your most youthful protege to the youthful town of Makima, and I promise to do my absolute best to protect him from all the evils in the world." Rock Lee then struck the good guy pose and joined his sensei's declarations of protection and eternal friendly rivalry. Tenten, and Neji, who had endured even longer. Thus, he intended to return to Makima after traveling with the youthful duo and with her passionate momentum. Miwa-chan could undoubtedly overwhelm even them. Then the rain began to fall on his fourth day in Konohagakure. Doihara Taiki had a theory regarding his new countrymen. The more shinobi there were, the less sanity there was per person, which he dubbed the conservation of shinobi sanity. He added a subclause about the effects of active engineering for ideology's sake versus passive acceptance because the senju apparently used to have a pretty damn odd sense of humor. This alone wasn't something that hadn't applied in Kirigakure either, though there the crazy had been of more bloody quality. To put it another way, how did we lose the last 3 wars? Of course, he would better remember to think of himself as Konohan, but even so, these, and, is, had now switched for him, or rather, he had switched. He was given low-security courier duty in the village for the next 6 months as a new defector. In theory, at least, he had plenty of time to train and rekindle his friendships with his former foes because carrying a few scrolls each day was merely a formality that justified his pay during his parole. When the village was unable to send him out and could not trust him with any sensitive information, patience, or training impressionable children, the latter, it turned out, took a lot less time than he had thought. The voice behind him said, "Hey, you there? The dry one with the long nose." Some distance away, Taiki turned around and swallowed the outburst of ire at the remark about his nose. It wasn't a crane's beak or anything, but it was a little long. However, since Naruto had left the village, he had already accepted some hazing because he was new there. The woman was approaching him quickly while holding up an orange umbrella as it began to rain once more. She had her coat open and her middle-length hair pulled back in a ponytail. Taiki looked up, hoping his smile wasn't as frozen as it felt. Although he had never met her before, he recognized her from the Kiri bingo book picture. She was Mitarashi Anko, a former pupil of the notorious Sanin Orochimaru. The notes and recommendations section of her page came to him naturally and without his having to call it to him. When offended, Mitarashi displays symptoms of a mixed state, which is characterized by the co-occurrence of mania and depression symptoms in her case. This manifests as a tendency toward frustration and outbursts of rage. He asked in a level voice, "How can I help you?" and shifted his weight slightly more favorably. He pondered whether she wore her coat that way to gain justification for attacking others. Without giving Taiki time to understand or inquire as to whether she had been stalking him, she grabbed his left arm and began dragging him down the street. "That was your last scroll today, wasn't it? Great, I'm Mitarashi Anko and I'm taking you to the Ninja Mouse for the traditional meet, greet and make sure we never killed one another's loved ones session, come." The Ninja Mouse was a tiny bar that seemed to be very well liked. Taiki notes that all of the tables and the bar's seating were taken, but Mitarashi didn't let that deter her. She just pushed her way into a table that had 3 other people at it. They were nodded at by a man who had a senbon in his mouth and a green bandana tied around his head. The other man, a considerably more stern-looking man with an eye patch and a bandana, hardly gave Taiki a sidelong glance before continuing to speak to a stunning but severe-looking woman whose hair was an amazing dark shade that verged on purple. "Hey guys, this is Doihara Taiki. Taiki, these are Shiranui Genma, Akame Iwana, and Azuki Yugo," Anko said as she introduced the group. The person named Shiranui Genma said, "It's nice to meet you," and Taiki returned the greeting. Yugo said to Iwana, "Why don't you just electrocute the pests?" Yugo didn't appear surprised when Iwana yelled, "And let them die and rot inside the air ducts. Have you got any idea how bad the smell would get? This rain has driven snakes inside and they have taken refuge in the ducts," Genma said sweetly in a stage whisper as Anko yelled for sake. The archives appeared to have a bit of a pest problem. At this point, a dark-haired young man burst through the door of the bar, hitting the wall with such a loud bang that a number of people jumped and turned to stare, their hands pointing non-discreetly at their weapons. The man marched to their table without paying attention to his turn. The man said, "Anko, I need you at the T&I." Without introducing himself, Anko became noticeably happier as a result. With a very distracting backstretch, she got up and said, "Great, can I be the meaner one? What's my story?" The man who had not yet been given a name seemed perplexed. "What do you mean, your story?" Taiki felt as though he was slipping back into his familiar niche as the quiet observer at the periphery of any crowd he had ever been a part of. It almost gave this place a homey feel. "I need a story so I can be properly menacing. Remember that course we were given about method acting? Did he kill my little brother, for example?" she inquired. Genma said, "You actually took that drivel seriously?" And Anko gestured angrily at him. Unconvinced, the T&I shinobi inquired, "You have a little brother?" The reason Iwana said, "I can't take mongoose in, they don't have the security clearance," was unclear. It took Taiki a moment to realize he was talking about something completely different. Anko growled, "I must have had one if that bastard killed him," with all sincerity. Yugo noted, "Neither have the snakes," in a very sensible tone. Thus, Uzumaki Naruto was bred and raised in this village. It was much more logical than Taiki had imagined it could be a day before. However, this wasn't a completely negative thing. He was already aware of the soul-killing effects of excessive normalcy. It was the first day after Maeda Guy and his group had left the village with Naruto. Tsubaki was aware that it had been hard to decide who would accompany him as Naruto's Junin sensei. Hitaki Kakashi would have been the obvious choice, but he was also Sasuke's sensei, and the Uchiha probably needed him more right now. The council wanted to assign one of the strongest Junin to watch Naruto's back because of the dangers of him being a genin Jinchuriki outside of his village, his recently acquired, regrettably widespread reputation, and the fact that no one trusted Kabuto enough to throw the Hokage monument. Tsubaki was somewhat taken aback that they allowed Naruto to return to Makima at all, but they surely had good reason, or Tsunade-sama had had enough of their arguments and had locked them all in a closet with Naruto for an hour. That would also explain it at times. Naruto's charm verged on reality warping. Sarutobi Asuma had been the first applicant, but Tsunade-sama had vetoed that, stating that the man was required in Konoha to assume some of Danzo's previous responsibilities. After the person who had mentioned Enko had had time to consider the situation, the proposal was quickly withdrawn. On the same team as Enko and Kabuto, gods forbid what might have happened if Naruto had been supported by two of Orochimaru's former students on the same team. Kurenai's name had also been brought up, but Hyuga Hiyashi ultimately decided against exposing his delicate, priceless daughter to Kabuto's influence, so Maeda Guy was chosen instead. Evidently, Neji was far more resilient than Hinata. Although Tsubaki would have felt sorry for Naruto, she felt enough sympathy for herself to be unsure of which of them was currently suffering more. In the center of the training field, she observed the children resting in parade. They all continued to dress similarly, but in order to give the kids a sense of individuality, she and Uruka sensei had bought a few different accessories, like leg warmers and bandanas. The kids were still unsure of how to react to that in general. They were hard to read, but if she had to guess, she would have described their present attitude as completely unapologetic. Walking them through the village at walking pace was the first exercise of the day to observe how they would behave around regular people. Initially, they hadn't exchanged any words, no eye contact, no greetings, no touching, no signs of curiosity. Uruka sensei then explained that the exercise's goal was to teach them how to interact with others. She had given her name. Now, what have we learned from today's experience? Yuki-chan, she had asked before being freed. About half of the kids had no names at all. She believed that Naruto's explanation of Danzo's death was far too simple really, though, it was sufficient to get her to forgive the kids. A charming young girl with black hair approaches an elderly woman who is in front of a grocery store and feels the tomatoes. An elderly woman walking down the street is approached by a cute, naive-looking girl carrying concealed weapons. Tomatoes are like people, they shouldn't bruise too easily. Good day, ma'am, I hope you are feeling well today. Old people die and you don't look very good. Yuki-chan made a head-tilting motion that was more akin to a snake's than a bird's. Even so, she managed to make it look cute. In the end, she stated, people don't appreciate honesty or unasked opinions. In her mouth, butter wouldn't have melted. And how about you, Tamaki-kun? Uruka sensei asked in a voice that entirely bypassed the area of Tsubaki's mind that was occupied by thought and consideration, instead focusing on the instinctive, primal obedience. She blinked in surprise as she realized she was standing in parade rest. Uruka named a boy with red bracers, who meekly repeated, a tap on the superior officer's shoulder is not an attack, and even if it was, he can defend himself from his student's civilian parents. Uruka sensei whispered, this is going to be a long year, Tsubaki sensei. Of evening classes, no less, and Tsubaki flinched when she recalled that he still had to instruct his regular student. She believed that until everything was over, she would either kill him to put an end to his suffering or fall into bed with him, bonding over shared trauma and life-threatening circumstances. Perhaps the latter was more forgiving, but she wasn't that kind of girl, and he had a really unfairly hot teacher's voice. Neji kept an eye on Naruto's back as they made their way down the muddy road to Migiwa, a coastal city from which they would take a boat to Makimura, a town in the tea country. However, the red umbrella made it appear more than a little ridiculous that the still orange-clad genin bounced more than he walked. He was darting between Kabuto and Tenten and back again, but he was noticeably avoiding Lee and Guy sensei. He talked about everything and nothing. Uruka sensei and his friends in Makimura, Ramen, Sasuke and Sakura and Sai, but never in great detail. He was almost offensively cheerful in spite of the torrential rain, wondering where his seal was. Neji kept an eye on his back. He had figured it out. Of course, when they faced off in the finals, Naruto first spoke about Hinata's honor and the Chunin position. Despite how difficult it had been to accept, Neji was thankful that Naruto had prevailed in the battle over Hinata, even though neither had turned into a chunin. Neji hadn't believed Naruto when he yelled that he understood what it was like to have a seal ruin your life. Then came Gamabunta himself, the enormous toad boss, and the invasion had started. Had assumed the form of a fox with 9 tails for a horrible moment, Neji believed that the Biju Yondaime had somehow come back from hell to murder them all. However, his Byakugan had been in action, and he had witnessed the toad in the somewhat fictitious shape of a fox. He had witnessed Naruto wearing a cloak of chakra that appeared so toxic that a man should faint at the sight of him, so corrosive that it should burn through the toad beneath him all the way to the bones after the battle was over. He began to reflect on how the adults in the village used to shun Naruto as if he were a defective exploding tag that hadn't yet decided to go off, but he never gave an explanation as it happened. They had been forbidden to do so under threat of death. He still wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to ask Naruto, but he had planned to talk to him and ask him questions. However, after the invasion, he had been extremely busy. After Uchiha defected, Naruto and Jiraiya-sama left, and that was the end of it so far. Even in Makima, he seemed to be in great demand. If even a small portion of his stories were accurate, if only he could find some time to spend alone with Naruto. Kabuto observed him. Anyone else would have looked blatantly foolish in the bright orange rain poncho he was wearing over his clothes, but Neji had to force himself to fight the urge to activate his Byakugan and reveal himself in such a way. Neji didn't think for a moment that Kabuto had simply defected back to the enemy, and a true shinobi never told them that they had unnerved him. He was tempted to snap at him and ask, "What do you want?" If anything, though, being a Hyuga as a child had improved his self-control. Kabuto slowed his pace and took a few sidesteps before leaving Naruto's side to go up to Neji's sensei. "I must ask, Gai-san, why you and your protege aren't wearing anything to cover you from the rain?" he said. Naruto was conveniently left alone after just speaking with Kabuto. Neji scowled. Gai-sensei and Lee had nothing to shield them from the rain, but Kabuto was right when he said that everyone else had rain ponchos, except for Naruto, who was the only one to tie a hand up with an umbrella. With Lee echoing his words and the genjutsu of a cotton candy bright rainbow appearing behind their backs, Gai-sensei declared, "The flames of the youth of our springtime will keep us dry," and made the good guy pose. "That is interesting. It can't be a chakra control technique because Lee can perform it as well, yet you still manipulate the pure physical energy in your bodies. It is rather similar to the opening of the gates, isn't it? Though you are obviously the one who supplies the genjutsu." When Gai-sensei abruptly turned to face Kabuto, Neji was genuinely taken aback, as was Tenten, who stopped walking and simply gazed at her sensei and teammate as if they had just grown wings. Neji knew that this was a purposeful opening, even though Kabuto didn't wink at him or shift his courteous, vacant gaze away from Gai-sensei. He now had to decide whether or not to accept it. Neji continued to have doubts about Kabuto, and the defector's portrayal of Gai-sensei was concerning. Even though his sensei occasionally exhibited eccentric behavior, nobody ever made a fool of themselves on nearly every occasion. Since he didn't even understand why Kabuto felt it was necessary, he really ought to tell his teacher about the distraction. It wasn't like he wouldn't be able to talk to Naruto in any other way, and perhaps Kabuto had tricked everyone, including Naruto. He had no reason to question the genin's loyalty, but judging by the way he continued to pursue Haruno, Naruto wasn't the most astute of individuals. The Uchiha, however, had returned to Konoha, and such a setback to Orochimaru's plans belied any deceit unless, in some way, Orochimaru had already obtained what he desired from the Uchiha. The risk of being a shinobi was to overanalyze everything, look beneath the surface, and generate a variety of theories based on a lack of information. Naruto was now shifting his focus to the direct questioning of motives, which slipped away from Kabuto's humorous deflection like water off a duck's back. It was time for him to decide. "Naruto." Neji stood beside him in a rush of motion, his stride lengthened. "There are a few things I want to ask you. In for 100, in for a Ryo." He had trouble trusting others, but perhaps it was time to begin. Furthermore, it's possible that Naruto knew about Kabuto's serious injuries. He knew without using his Byakugan that the enraged medic would now undoubtedly appear obscenely arrogant. Though he wasn't sure he liked the tone of the conversation, Naruto was about to ask what Kabuto and Maeda Guy were discussing when Neji happened to walk by and wanted to strike up a conversation. Confused, he said, "Okay, what you wanted to know?" Apart from the Chunin exams, he had never spoken to Neji, and their relationship had not been cordial. However, Ino claimed to have told Neji to stop bothering Hinata and clean up his act before he left with Jiraiya. Everyone knew that if you stubbed your toe in your bathroom in the middle of the night, she would inquire about your well-being the following day. Given that her father served in the T&I, it was most likely inherited. Neji asked suddenly, "Why aren't you bothered by anything?" Then, with a loud click of his teeth, he closed his mouth. But I'm bothered by a lot of things, half-asked Naruto, frowning. Even though Danzo was no longer alive, his eerie presence continued to haunt Naruto from the afterlife. Then there was the foolish fox in his stomach, Orochimaru, and Akatsuki. Aside from that, Miwa-chan and the foolish cult that had most likely gotten out of control during his absence. It would be unfair to dump this on him, even though it was kind of entertaining to picture his reaction if someone tried to tell him that he was now a living saint. If he wasn't careful, they would also somehow drag Gaara into it. The statement, "I know you have Kyuubi sealed in you," was made by Neji. Startled, Naruto hissed. Given the invasion and all the people who were diverting his attention, he may not have been very subtle, but since no one else had mentioned it, he assumed that the giant fox issue had gone unnoticed. Apparently not. He began to object, but Neji didn't seem to notice. "I swear I'm not going to," he said. "So how come you aren't bitter at all? Or are you bitter? Are you just that good at faking it? Why Kabuto betrayed Orochimaru, and do you trust him at all? And why is he running interference so we can talk without anyone listening in?" One inquiry after another fell like raindrops when Neji stopped. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles as pale as his lips, and his mouth was a thin, pale line. "Kabuto's distracting them. That's just like him, you know. He's high-handed like that and sometimes needs really obvious things spelled out for him, like that betraying Konoha is going to make me seriously unhappy. And he does unnecessary things for me, but if it makes him happy and doesn't hurt anyone, I guess it's okay then. It's actually kind of scary how many totally oblivious people I know." Gaara and Sai were not inconsiderate. Simply put, he had been foolish in his own way. Inari had been in pain, just like Taiki and now Neji. "It's okay. He didn't betray me in his own head in the first place. It's just that his head can be a pretty screwy place." It wasn't as if they were unaware that giving up was wrong, were they? In any case, they had given up. "Sometimes I really wonder about people, or more like a lot of time," he admitted. "Why would Kabuto have cared if you were unhappy or not?" Neji responded. His ghostly eyes added to the effect of the look he was giving Naruto. Some older children at the orphanage had told Naruto that he could eat souls with his crazy ghost eyes, which had been so cool. As a pre-academy child, Naruto had tried to locate Hyuga Hiyoshi's doorbell so he could play Ding Dong Ditch with him. Unfortunately, there was nothing as modern and plebeian as a doorbell in the Hyuga mansion, and Naruto had been stopped until he covered the door with a bucket of water. The one time it had been left open, he didn't think Hiyoshi ever understood why Naruto had started stalking him across the village after he was glared at, and it had been eerily cool. Neji's appearance was somewhat similar, only when it was activated and the veins emerged would it have been truly eerie, in a good way, similar to eerie insects and old jutsu burn scars. However, even the standard white was extremely intense, with the exception of Hinata, who had to be the exception that demonstrated the rule at that time. Her eyes always appeared gentle. "Because Kabuto's my friend, and even he isn't so oblivious that he wouldn't realize that making your friends unhappy is a bad thing. And I'm not bitter because I'm going to change things. I'm going to make all Konoha realize that I'm not Kyuubi because I will protect them all. And do you really think that Hinata's ever going to brand anyone? Just trust her a little, and it'll all be alright. In the end we will come through for you. Believe it," Naruto exclaimed, nearly striking a good guy pose just to tease Neji, but it would have been needlessly harsh. Neji looked away and said, "So what are you saying? That's just how life is, so suck it up and survive." Like he was swallowing something foul and trying desperately not to throw it up, his voice was thick and raspy. Naruto tipped the umbrella back and held up his hand palm up, saying, "It's life and nobody survives living, so why make ourselves unhappy when we can be happy? Just because it's hard now doesn't mean it's going to be hard forever." Hey, it stopped raining too. Above them was a pale, hardly perceptible rainbow. But there were no drops. It was all wonderful because he hadn't looked forward to walking all the way back to Migiwa in the rain. Neji whispered, "Just like that," and Naruto turned to face him in time to see his shoulders slump in submission. It wasn't a bad kind of surrender, though, much like when Naruto finally gave in to Uruka-sensei and allowed him to fuss over him and apply a bandage to the scrapes on his knees. The best kind of surrender was when you let someone do something for you. When he said, "Just try to be happy," after all, it wasn't a lot to ask. Practically speaking, it was instinctual. And Neji gave him a meek smile. Kabuto was aware that he had just increased Maeda Gai's mistrust of him. He wasn't suspicious of his intentions, but rather of the full scope of his abilities right now. Very little could accomplish that besides slinking out to meet Otto or Iwa Nin. He was unable to feel regret for it. He patiently said, "I am a medic Nin, Maeda-san," after agitating him for a long enough period of time. "I may not be Tsunade of the Sannin, but I am capable of detecting the use of physical energy, and I must congratulate you. Your use of it is ingenious." When it came to chakra control and medical techniques, he was not as naturally gifted as Tsunade of the Sannin. His lack of empathy was a major drawback for a medic, but his willingness to fight dirty more than made up for it. Tsunade was both a healer and a killer who had acquired the ability to heal at the moment. Tsunade could easily defeat him, but in a few years? Kabuto's smile was quite agreeable. In the same gentle, amiable tone as Kabuto, Maeda Guy inquired, "If I may ask, why you came back with the youthful Naruto? He may use it to deceive his pupils, but I'm not duped by the way you act. One see that you are more than the person you appear to be. Everybody needs to know who they are, don't you agree? And you can do with that as you like. You could never do it perfectly." When Maeda Guy glanced at Naruto, who was enjoying the sun peeking through the clouds with the innocent delight of a child, his eyes narrowed. Although Kabuto was certain that Naruto had blood on his hands, there was also a puzzling innocence about Naruto that was completely unaffected by the act of taking those lives. Though he was blind to the depths Naruto concealed behind his face, Maeda Guy could see that there was more to Kabuto than what he showed the world. Yes, he was aware that they existed. Only a raw genin or a blind and deaf ninja could not, but that didn't mean Guy knew what would stare back from those depths if he ever looked into them. Never before had he been sufficiently broken. Kabuto had endured a challenging education. Danzo was killed first, followed by his mother and Orochimaru. He was no longer in pain by the time Orochimaru got him. The feeling was similar to when you had minor surgery done under local anesthesia. You knew it should hurt, but it didn't. It was almost tearing and trembling. He had lost his pain, his mother, and his identity. His only remaining possession was Naruto, and he had no intention of letting that happen. Naturally, Guy was unable to comprehend even the mental game he was currently playing. The Hyuga clan was arguably the most powerful clan in Konoha at this point, but their unwillingness to compromise hurt their political clout. In her own modest way, Hyuga Hinata was already Naruto's, but she lacked the strength to help him out. Kabuto disliked uncertainty, but it was obvious that she was working on that. Let Neji depend on Naruto and turn into a devoted disciple of Naruto's philosophy after what her father had done to Neji's father. Hinata didn't seem to have the strength to deny Neji anything. The voice of Naruto exclaimed, "She can do that?" He pulled Neji back to the main group after that as best he could. The Hyuga prodigy maintained an arm's length distance from Naruto and trailed him by one step. Even though his chin was tilted proudly, he made no attempt to retract his arm, which was 100 words in itself. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Hey, Tenten, Neji told that you can make scrolls that open automatically when it hits the ground, right? And you can make scrolls without any air inside, right?" he asked. Neji was examining him as a merchant might examine a golden fruit tree. It was a very alluring sight that seemed too good to be true. Although it was okay, Kabuto had a suspicion that he was also showing some of that. Guy's gaze remained fixed on him rather than Neji. Tenten said, "I can." "Why?" A beam of sunlight shining through a hole in the clouds behind Naruto's head cast soft shadows over his face, gilding his hair as his smile grew. Even though the timing was most likely accidental, Kabuto enjoyed the dramatic effect. "Have you ever thought about making bombs? I have this great book and some of that stuff explodes the moment it comes in touch with oxygen. We would need a real laboratory for that." Naruto. Teammates 101 and own your soul. There will be a quiz later, so pay attention. When Naruto-kun was away, the days had flown by so slowly. Miwa occasionally considered calling him Naruto-sama instead, but Naruto never grumbled and she was weak. She could still recall the moment she wasn't prepared to give away the final memento, the honorific, because she believed Naruto was only slightly younger than her. She took care of his church, organized his books, and oversaw the fire department's training rotation and the in-girls self-defense classes. They really needed to stop referring to it as a cult, so Riku-ne found it hilarious to call Narutoism a cult. Significant such regrettable connotations should not be tolerated by any respectable religion. Lately, she had learned a lot. She now understood the meanings of terms like doctrine, anti-clericalism, and connotations, with the exception of those jerkish Buddhists who said they weren't a true religion because they weren't serious enough about themselves. She was ecstatic haha when the missionaries began converting the Wind Country people. Let's just watch them laugh. Matsuzaki's store was already closed in the evening. Technically, Matsuzaki-san could have gone back to work by now, but he seemed to prefer living alone at home, and Sakuya, his attractive older neighbor, had to do all of the shopping for him. Although Miwa was unaware of what had happened to him, she was handling his shop while he was away because Naruto-kun had assumed responsibility for it. She had taken the books to headquarters, but she had already closed the store. Recently, the police chief had been very submissive and confused, which gave Miwa hope that things might be different. She was a whore. After having been a Maiko, she was skilled at identifying men's flaws and using them against them if they didn't attack her first. She also admired Naruto-kun because he was the only one who had never displayed any of that desperate need for love, a sympathetic ear, safety, or anything else. However, he did not abuse his invulnerability. However, she had veered off course once more. If she could just make the world, and Naruto-kun, make sense to him, Yamamoto Takumo might be receptive to her arguments. She could also deliver. The tax office, regrettably, was less sensible, and the numbers were giving her headaches. A voice that seemed to be from Water Country said to her, "You might want to go outside." With a sharp yet lilting accent, Miwa nearly fell over her own hem as she jumped and spun around in her blue and gray. Konatsu was smiling amusedly at her. "You startled me," Miwa said, lifting herself out of the Caesar position and holding her hand above her heart. Even though Konatsu was younger than Miwa, she didn't want to sit down in front of the girl because, although Konatsu's brother was pleasant, she was the kind of ninja Miwa had heard about before meeting Naruto, as silent as snow falling, as frigid and lethal. Miwa was a little afraid because she could never understand Konatsu's thoughts, but Naruto-kun didn't seem to mind, so everything was probably fine. Konatsu said, "Someone has returned," and she cocked her head in the direction of the door, concealing her eyes with her hair. Only at this moment did Miwa listen to the joyful chatter of the kids outside, to the annoyance of his father. Naruto-kun had a group of kids who visited him every day to ask when he would return. One of the kids was the son of a police officer. Miwa was positive that he had tried to prevent Atsushimaru from coming. Poor kid. What were his parents thinking? But he might as well have tried to stop water from flowing downhill. Naruto was that person. When Atsushimaru said, "Naruto ni," Miwa's heart leapt. She sprinted to the door after dropping the book onto the tatami. They returned after 7 days. Her Naruto-kun was there. His tanned skin, sky blue eyes, golden hair, and orange outfit made him seem like a bold, determined brushstroke of all rainbow colors in a black and white ink painting that represented the rest of the world. Although Makima didn't appear colorless to her normally, he exuded an aura that made ordinary people and their typical hues seem insignificant. Naruto-kun was chatting with a group of 5 kids who were clinging to his legs while grinning broadly. Bone pale as ever, Kabuto was also present, but neither Sai nor Sasuke had returned. Nor had Tsubaki. Rather, there was a man in clingy green clothes. What about that haircut? And he had incredibly bright teeth, and at this time of year, was that rain of cherry blossoms behind him? Something to do with youth and spring? Additionally, holy shishti, had a woman really consented to have children with the man? Another one? In addition, a typical boy and girl were present, but she ignored them. She couldn't, really. So the 2 green-clad individuals were ninja. But not just any ninja? At least she hoped so. "Naruto-kun, welcome back," she voiced in a hoarse manner. Naturally, though, Naruto-kun heard her and pulled everyone to her while introducing themselves. Miwa held on to the person she knew at least a little bit. "It's nice to see you, Kabuto. I hope your trip went well." "Naruto, I have kept your business in order, and the church has decided to send missionaries to the Wind Country to convert people to the Narutoism," she said. Naruto-kun appeared somewhat constipated and made a strangled noise. He was very humble, which is undoubtedly a commendable trait, but Miwa and her fellow believers had to make sure he didn't unintentionally hurt his cause. She was confident in his assessment of Naruto-kun's value and was determined to get the rest of the world to recognize it. The world was going to recognize her devotion to Naruto-kun. Whether it was through hell or high water, unbound Biju or locust plague, it was beneficial to him. "I approve," said Kabuto. Of course, she had met him before they left Makima for Konoha, but they had hardly exchanged words for the first time. Miwa recognized a fellow follower as she turned to face him. She smiled her brightest smile at him. "I am honored to meet you, Kabuto. In which capacity are you here, if I may ask?" she replied. "I'm under observation by Konoha." "Really? But I'm a medic nin," Kabuto stated. "The possibilities of a medic. That's wonderful. I have kept thinking that someone should teach the great Naruto Fire Brigade at least the basic first aid, but finances are a bit tight until the next month. Would you consider helping us?" A devoted priestess's work was never finished, thank heavens. It felt good to return to Makima, although he didn't live there. Miwa-chan did, and it appeared that Konatsu-chan and Kaide had recently grown to like it. There was also Matsuzaki, who had reportedly stopped going out and interacting with people recently. In any case, Naruto decided to go meet him before he left after wondering why. Even though Matsuzaki had been odd about the whole beating up Yakuza thing, he had been kind of cool for an old man anyway. Since when was it wrong to beat up criminals? Naturally, Naruto had to look after Miwa and the other girls afterward. 4 of the fire department girls could now handle the water bullet, according to Konatsu-chan, and if that wasn't fantastic, what was? A huge surprise was now in store for any shady guy who attempted to get their hands on them. He had been right about Miwa getting totally out of control. Of course, Miwa decided that they needed to organize a pilgrimage after he foolishly mentioned that the Wind Country was Gaara's territory while they were preaching there. "So this is my life now," he said, leaning back on his arms while his porch looked up at the starry sky. There were not many stars visible from Makima. The majority of the small star twinkles were drowned by the corona of the town's lights. However, he noticed the large stars, which somewhat reminded him of Konoha. Although Konoha was a large village, it was dark at night. Even the general public recognized the need to blend in, and aside from festival evenings, the stars were always visible. "It's not like you have protested that strenuously," a voice called from the courtyard. "Just what you expected." Although it was rather embarrassing, at least Idate was practically as skilled as a shinobi, so it wasn't like a civilian had ambushed him when he waved at him. Naruto was still a little sheepish. Then he told Idate, "She's a girl and girls are scary." Naturally, not all of them were equally frightening. Some, like Tsunade Bachan, were frightening and could finger flick you through a wall, but that wasn't as frightening because, at her core, Tsunade Bachan was a big softy. Some, like Ino, were frightening since she was familiar with everyone. Some, like Sakura-chan, were frightening because their mere appearance made you want to be foolish, and if you were foolish, she would harm you. It was a clever kunoichi booby trap that was made to hit innocent genin heads and bring them joy, hee. Then there were girls who were just as frightening as Uruka-sensei. Uruka-sensei wasn't a girl, so that sounded a little off, but it still counted because he was better than most girls at adopting the "I'm going to do this in the name of your own good" mentality. In the hidden villages, guys wouldn't be sensitive about being referred to as girls. However, Naruto had a theory that Uruka had some strange sort of denial going on there. As even the Junin were hesitant to give him less than perfect mission reports, Uruka-sensei would have only been offended about being called scary in that extra scary way of his, but that was that. You never knew what would make the girls go scary on you because sometimes they were just plain scary and unintelligible, but that was a plus because ninjas were meant to be frightening and unintelligible. "Well done, girls. She isn't out to make me eat my broccoli and asparagus, but that doesn't mean she isn't Uruka-sensei," he said. "Except Uruka-sensei actually knows what's best for me, and Miwa's just scary like Uruka-sensei, you know?" Idate sat next to him and muttered, "I'm not sure I want to actually understand that one, so I'm going to pretend I do." He had, after all, been away from the village for a while since Naruto would eventually have to visit his brother. He needed to resolve that annoying technically dead or he would be a missing nin situation after Tsunade Bachan stopped being snarky about Kabuto, perhaps. "I have thought about asking Miwa-chan out, you know?" Idate replied even though it was unexpected. Naruto smiled. "I mean, my family has thought about setting up a business here, and those inns and that casino boat of yours need supplies." "So you're going to live here, too? That's great, now I can visit everyone at the same time," Naruto gasped. Idate said, "You're going to visit us?" And Naruto snorted, "What dumb questions." He was going to come as often as he could. Of course they were his pals. In addition, he needed to monitor Miwa and her frightening high priestess split personality. Idate scoffed. "Like you have managed so far," she said. Naruto objected, "Hey, I try, she's just, you know, a scary girl." He had no idea why he even befriended such frightening individuals in the future. He would be better off remaining with individuals like Kabuto, Gaara, and Sasuke. Wait a moment, did I say that out loud? "As long as nobody's celibate," complained Idate, "least of all Miwa-chan." Naruto questioned, why would Miwa-chan be celibate? Really, Idate had no justification for giving him the hairy eyeball. Makimura was nice, this way or that for his friends. It was a home even though it wasn't his. Naruto enjoyed the sense of acceptance because so few people had ever invited him to stay at their home. The only thing left to do was wait for Jiraiya-sensei. Except for the first day, which was more like half a day, Naruto spent 4 reasonably calm days in Makimura. Guy began assisting Idate with his taijutsu, and Kabuto began teaching the fire brigade girls first aid, including bandaging and CPR techniques, without using jutsu because it required an excessive amount of chakra control. Guy seemed to remember Idate from earlier, which caused some initial problems, but in the end, Guy was quite cool about it. After a training session with the girls, Idate entered the room with his bangs glued flat against his skull from perspiration. "You are aware that Idate-san has left Konoha most unyouthfully?" he asked Naruto. Idate winced, but he raised his chin in defiance and maintained his position, merely moving his legs slightly apart to improve his balance. Naruto knew that Idate would say something foolish, such as that Guy could take him to Konoha and that the Wasabi family never knew anything about him, so he had to interrupt before his mouth could open and flatten into a thin line. Naruto wouldn't have fled either if Uruka-sensei's safety was in jeopardy or something, but that was different because he wouldn't have left Konoha either. The part about protecting the Wasabi family wasn't stupid because only rats ratted out their families. No pun intended, it wasn't even all that funny. It had been Uruka-sensei who had thwarted Mizuki-sensei. Naruto believed that perhaps he had simply been extremely fortunate when it came to teachers, as Kakashi-sensei would never have pulled a Mizuki-sensei on him with the exception of the part where, years before Naruto even used the term, Mizuki bastard had taught him taijutsu and performed a Mizuki-sensei on him. It wasn't until the tension in the room dropped like a ton of bricks and was replaced by those blank looks that indicated Naruto had once again forgotten that other people didn't live in his brain that he realized he had said aloud, "Hey, since Aoi predated Mizuki, should I refer to it as pulling an Aoi instead?" It wasn't until their hands strayed that vital half-inch from their kunai pouches that he realized how prepared Konatsu-chan and Kaide had been for battle. Kabuto didn't display anything, but he refused to. He defended himself by saying, "I was just thinking out loud," but it didn't really stop the stares. Naruto gave up. Protecting your family wasn't foolish, but believing that Idate needed to be brought back to Konoha was. Look, I knew it after that T-Country race mission when Ibiki came to debrief us. He's your friend, right? Shouldn't you trust his judgment on this? Furthermore, although he wasn't positive if Guy and Ibiki were actually friends, they shared a similar age range, and Guy was the type of person who made friends with people whether they wanted to or not. He promised them a lifetime of friendship while dazzling them with sunsets and the power of youth. When you tried to run after him to protest, you discovered that he had tied your sandal straps together while you were rubbing your eyes. As was well known in Konoha, Guy wanted to nurse you back to the youthful bloom of health with the power of youth. After the ground hit you over the head, she gave you band-aids, but you ultimately decided it was safer to say yes. He was somewhat truly Guy like that. Naturally, Naruto was so Naruto that he was unable to recognize the similarities. He is, indeed. Guy met his gaze directly, and Naruto turned to face him, prepared to turn the situation into a problem. Aoi had made amends for his evil actions, and Ibiki was cool with it. However, a tiny smile split Guy's face before he could object any further. Soft around the edges, it appeared strange on his face, and Naruto felt oddly honored to see that little smile rather than the man's usual large, glittering grin. "Yes, valiant Ibiki is my friend and I am glad that you have not betrayed his trust," he replied. Naruto found it difficult to take his eyes off of Guy's face. Even though his team hovered somewhere behind him and most likely looked incredibly perplexed, he swallowed. Although Guy had been violent in his battle with Kisame, he was capable of more fierce things. "Yeah, not like Sakura-chan did either, or Sasuke, whatever else that bastard betrayed," he said. Guy yelled, "My eternal rival must be terribly proud of you," and positioned Naruto in the good guy pose. Imitating Lee behind him that kind of ruined the mood in a different manner, it didn't. Naruto sincerely hoped Kakashi-sensei would be pleased with him. Naruto muttered, "So, we agree on this," and began dragging Idate to the kitchen in order to escape from everything. However, he stopped there after passing Konatsu-chan and Kaide, who had been excellent throughout the entire ordeal. Now they owed it to themselves. "Thanks, you were great. Like any village that would have had that greatness must be terminally stupid. Did the daimyo drop it on its head when it was founded?" He replied they had been prepared to battle Guy, and it took a lot of bravery to be willing to take on someone who was wearing so much spandex. Kaide said, "It's okay, it was mostly Konatsu." He looked down as his feet scuffed the off-white tatami. It would have been extremely low to tease him for his lashes now, but Naruto saw that they were incredibly long and girly for a boy. Konatsu-chan said, "Except when it wasn't. You're alright too, Naruto," and then she looked him in the eye nearly. "Have you given any thought to continuing your bloodline a few years down the road? Our genes would be awesome together." Thus Kabuto was teaching the girls how to make ointments for burn wounds and other wounds, and Konatsu-chan, who had joined the Scary Brigade, wanted a child eventually and was willing to let him have one too. Naturally, Miwa-chan remained Miwa-chan. "The world is like a birthday cake. Taking a piece is okay, but more is rude. Let's keep things in." Makima. Naruto attempted to convince her the lovely hairpin she wore made a tingling sound as she cocked her head. Miwa-chan gave him that knowing eyebrow and said, "Are you trying to convince me that you have ever taken only one piece of any cake on the table?" Naruto tried to sink through the floor and made a guilty eeping sound. Thus, Idate hadn't been arrested and things weren't any more crazy than they usually were. This was his life, somehow, and Miwa and Maida Guy had possibly joined the cult. Naruto was too afraid of the answer to inquire. Jiraiya-sensei then returned. It was unusual that he was early. There was nothing out of the ordinary about him having a pretty girl with him. Naruto was seated on an antique sofa that had been discovered somewhere in the evening. Because he and everyone else had eaten their cereal and nutrition pills from a brand new takoyaki the ninja mouse plate that morning. Things had just appeared while he was away and continued to appear. These had been an emergency purchase because, for some reason, an unfortunate chemical experiment that had apparently been carried out in the middle of the night without waking anyone had contaminated all the other plates in the house. Naruto kind of wished he had thought of it first, but it was nice to not be the obvious suspect while Kaide pulled a face that led Naruto to believe he was responsible. Konatsu made faces and held her chopsticks as if she wanted to impale the courageous mouse shinobi with them. His mouth was still twitching, but he had been able to control the snickering. The twitching made it clear that Konatsu has shame and I'm lucky. Guy stoked the fires of youth within us. Let our mouse comrades inspiring, youthful example do the same. Yikes. Alright. So while the plates may have been extremely embarrassing, they were also secretly kind of cool because Naruto never received the ninja mouse plate he had desired as a child due to the orphanage's financial difficulties. The sofa was nice. At least Naruto read a certain beloved book about explosives while curled up on it and pulling his knees up to rest his chin on them. Hey, Tenten, what about tracking explosives? They're paint bombs with really sticky, slow drying, smelly paint. Makes you leave tracks wherever you go and can't be washed away without turpentine, he said from the kitchen. Tenten made some ambiguous sounds that left Naruto unsure of whether she was paying attention or not, but she was preoccupied with creating bombs, which was a challenging task. Though the air didn't cool, at least not in front of the window, the colors in the room did as the sun sank behind some trees on the hill to the west. When Naruto saw Jiraiya sensei, he was just staring absently because he was feeling lazy. He initially believed it to be a random white-haired guy and was unaware that it was his sensei. Jiraiya sensei had many muscles, but they were bulkier than Kakashi sensei's, despite the fact that he was not fat at all. In fact, Naruto would have likely initially thought he was Kakashi sensei if his hair had been shorter and he had been wearing a mask. The only typical aspect of the entire scene was the attractive woman trotting after him in a slightly uncomfortable manner. He was also wearing some clothing that Naruto had never seen on him before. Naruto yelled, "Hey, Ero sensei," and flung open the window. Naruto warned the woman as he leapt through the window, "You were early. What's happened to you? You look really terrible, and who have you tricked into coming with you this time? You better leave now, lady. He's an incurable pervert." Her snort was far less ladylike than the modest gesture, and she covered her mouth with her hand. Naruto took to her right away. Ero sensei said, "You should respect your teacher, brat, more than you ever do." While giving him a much gentler than appearance thud on the head, he performed the silly hopping dance he always did when he began yelling words like gallant and legendary around. "I am the gallant Jiraiya, and I have lived up to my reputation by saving this fair maiden," he exclaimed. Naruto believed Jiraiya must have been subjected to severe bullying because he had read that being teased can cause people to act strangely a great deal. Naturally, Naruto was so Naruto that he was unable to recognize the similarities at all. She used to be Fujikaze Yukie when she was still hiding from her evil uncle. Is she a princess? I once saved a princess too. That was Koyuki Haim, the girl was told, and he wondered where she was royalty and what evil advisor or relative needed his ass kicked right now. However, she simply shook her head and appeared quite dejected. "My name is Morimoto Tomomi and I'm no princess," she responded. Ero sensei coughed sharply just as Naruto was about to comfort her, telling her that whatever the jerks in Iowa had done to her, they didn't deserve her in the first place and that they would get their asses kicked if Jiraiya sensei hadn't already lived up to his self-appointed nickname. "I used to be a kunoichi of Iowa." He handed the letter to Naruto, smirking. "Funny thing you mentioned Kazuhana Koyuki. My information network intercepted her letter to you," he said. Naruto cheered and picked it up, but when he saw that it had already been opened, his attitude soured. "Hey, did you read this? Because reading other people's post might be a shinobi thing, but we're only supposed to go shinobi on non-Konohan shinobi, and now I'm going to read your post right back. That will teach him." Perhaps Ero sensei would compose a cheesy love letter that he could also make fun of. Had Koyuki Haim not written a sentimental love letter? Since she was older and Naruto liked Sakura-chan, she had never given him the puppy eyes or cow eyes that those Uchiha fangirls always made when Sasuke passed by them. However, given his recent luck, Koyuki may have been struck by lightning or something and had fallen in love with him. Ero sensei was then going to cruelly make fun of him. However, his expression was more solemn and irate than anything else. "I can't leave you alone even for a moment, can I? This letter only confirmed what my network already told me. You have apparently decided to found a Jinchuriki cult. Never mind that you were supposed to keep a low profile, and a ruler of a sovereign state has decided to found a holy day in your honor in lieu of a proper protocol to offer congratulations for this. It's in midwinter and it's celebrated by handing out presents and bringing symbolical evergreen trees inside. presumably to die in a symbolic way. Naruto exclaimed, "Hey, that's great," but was immediately deflated by the fading gaze this time. Ero-sensei appeared to be serious. He was talking incoherently and may not have been telling the truth, but damn it, he had been right. "It wasn't my fault. These crazy missing finger people started trying to beat me up and then they tried to rape Miwa-chan. What was I supposed to do? And it really was evil to tell Konatsu-chan to kill her brother, so I gave her shelter, and that Hunter Nin failed evil forever, so he stayed too. Except now he's staying in Konoha." Even though things had gotten out of control, he couldn't and didn't regret anything. Then that police chief thought I was a Yakuza boss, but no worries, we had a sports day and he changed his mind except, he kind of decided that I was a cult leader instead, and Taiki had sent that letter to Kiri, and then Miwa-chan decided that having a cult was a great idea, so it wasn't my fault. Jiraiya-sensei did not appear to have any faith in his innocence. Naruto assumed that the reason he was holding his face in his palms was simply that he didn't have a handy surface to strike his head against. His face was flushed, and he was huffing as if he were twice as heavy as before rather than significantly lighter. He groaned, "Not even 2 whole months," giving Jiraiya-sensei a pat on the arm. He decided to show him some mercy and share some good news. "But I got Sasuke back too." "Well, Kabuto got him back too, and I got Kabuto pardoned, so everything's okay on that front," he said. Yakushi Kabuto, what? Itachi approved of the hate in Deidara's eyes, but not for the reason that anyone who had heard his official justification for going missing, the words he had used to signal a seppuku by proxy to his brother, would have assumed. According to Deidara's vow, "I will kill you one day, whatever it takes," involuntarily, his pupils contracted, and it was obvious that he expected Itachi to become enraged, but he had stated that it was not going to be enough to control him. That was what Itachi was counting on. The boy had such amazing potential, but he looked more like a half-drowned rat than anything else, with his clothes ripped and stuck to his body and his hair hanging limply. In the Earth Country, it was raining and the sun was lowering. Itachi cherished nighttime rain that was sufficient for him. He could hear the water falling. He was accustomed to seeing and remembering so much that he occasionally questioned why his brain didn't bleed as much as his eyes did. Fortunately, he was unable to see what he heard in the darkness. Even at its best, Sharingan eyes weren't better than Byakugan in every way, despite their fame and notoriety. It still required more than a clear line of sight and a cloud-covered night sky. Even as he played his part, Itachi took great pleasure in the fact that this night would be completely dark and that, far from any human habitation, there was the sound of 100,000 raindrops and more the fresh smell of damp leaves. The water on his face, and the air flowing through his hair made him feel cool. Deidara challenged him, "Aren't you going to do anything?" But the former Iwajunin's vitals remained unchanged. Itachi had no doubts that he desired death. Itachi wasn't very interested in living his own life, which was unfortunate, but if wishes were fish, then nobody would ever go hungry. He rolled his shoulders in a well-planned show of disinterest and asked, "Am I supposed to care?" It may be an oxymoron, but it works well to bring back some of the old flame in Deidara. The younger man's cheeks flushed and his nostrils flared. The heavy drops rolled off Itachi's hair and down onto the tip of his nose, then down his cheeks and over his lips to drip off the end of his chin. In this world of hate, people are resources to be used. You are no more special than any other. You are worth no more than many better than you who are dead now. The last rays of the sun were so sweet that they made him feel cold even when he wasn't. The rain still had a pure taste and feel. Itachi had a very valid reason for luring Deidara in. He was unaware of Kakuzu's motivation for accepting the mission to murder this man's lover, and it had little bearing on their predicament when Deidara learned that Itachi was a part of the same terrorist organization as Tomomi's killer. His resentment of Itachi for making him live and for forcing him to support yet another cause only grew. At any time when Akatsuki felt strong enough, Deidara would detonate like a time bomb. There were many things to say about Itachi, but he had never forgotten his one true loyalty, the one that made even the cold rain worthwhile, that he had felt when he stood in front of the memorial stone following the Yondaimi's death. Even though he had very few reasons to be thankful, he somehow remembered that every day was a day to be thankful that he had survived and made the decision to be faithful. What else could he possibly be if he wasn't loyal? Deidara's hand opened slightly at the palm. Since this technique had been outlawed and forgotten for longer than he had lived, Itachi had never seen it used in combat before. Grinning, he let Deidara take his clay. He reminded himself that every day he learned something new was a day to be thankful. Itachi could be criticized in many ways, but no one ever called him a fool before. He could walk down the street of any settlement other than Konoha without a well-meaning adult asking him where his mother was. He had mastered the art of sabotage once more. One of the Konoha had prepared an explosive in the country of Earth. Slowly but surely, its fuse was burning shorter and shorter. It was yet another gorgeous evening in Makima. "You totally didn't know that about your own village, did you? What kind of spy master are you anyway? Naruto was seated across the table from Jiraiya in the safe house that was converted into operations headquarters, and he wasn't at all shocked when Kabuto entered a few minutes later. His scent was as gentle as milk and as agreeable as please. A few privacy seals made sure no one could listen in on the remaining misfits, who had been sent out of the house for about an hour. His insistence on answers regarding Kabuto had devolved into a digression about Danzo. A spy master who spends the majority of his time hundreds of miles from Konoha spying on her enemies. He stated his excuse didn't work, and he had to reluctantly acknowledge that it didn't, as Naruto gave him a stern look. It was Danzo. The sad truth about being a ninja is that there is always a bigger fish. Kiddo, there is always someone better and badder than you. I guess I just found mine. Admitting that was like swallowing glass. Jiraiya hadn't been completely outclassed in anything in a long time. In his younger days, Salamander Hanzo had beaten Sandame's 3 students in a duel and given them the name Sanin because he was so impressed that they could fight him and not perish right away. No teacher could ever consider that a defeat, even though his pupil had outperformed him in both the art of battle and sealing. Although the old man had aged well, Jiraiya was pretty sure that he could have defeated his own teacher in combat during Sandame's second reign. Although he hadn't figured out the invasion, he had at least been on the right track. Just in time. He had even warned Konoha that the leaders of Sand and Sound had been meeting behind closed doors and that he had suspicions that the Otokage was actually Orochimaru. His spy network was the best in the elemental countries. The fall was painful because he had grown accustomed to being at the top of his game. It wasn't that I didn't know Danzo had his fingers in many pies. I thought never mind that. It seems that Danzo let me to find out just enough that I didn't get suspicious about the rest of it. But that is a wonderful conversation for another day. Jiraiya focused all of his energy on Kabuto as well. The technique was somewhat similar to killing intent, but it let the target feel the observation physically. Even civilians could occasionally do it by accident, but Jiraiya had heard it likened to divine judgment when one of the Sanin's chakras was involved. Kabuto didn't interrupt anyone. He didn't flinch at all. That made Jiraiya's mood even darker. Why did you bring back Uchiha Sasuke? I can't imagine it was from the goodness of your heart. He murmured. Power was symbolized by the Jinchuriki. And if Naruto can overcome his fear of Kyuubi's power and learn to control it effectively, it could be the largest power boost in the elemental countries. Jiraiya had to do a double take when Kabuto responded. I once promised Naruto-sama that when he founded a ninja organization I would join it. Naruto-sama gave me the color of a person who always keeps his promises. The entire thing didn't make much sense, but he understood every single word. He questioned Naruto. Care to explain this? When he asked Naruto, of all people, to explain someone even more inexplicable than himself, it was a very sad day. At this point, Naruto gave Kabuto one of those heartbreakingly bright smiles, and Jiraiya realized with a twinge of sadness that he had likely been Naruto's first friend. Well, I sneaked out of the orphanage this one time when I was a kid because the bigger kids kept talking about how cool it would be to sneak out at night, and then I met Kabuto and then we were friends. How this could have unfolded. Oh Shishti, no one else played ninja like we did. We even had drop bags in. Jiraiya's voice rose in pitch until it broke at the end. Drop bags? Were you preparing to take Naruto with you? It was one thing to miss Danzo, but that he had missed? If Jiraiya had allowed Orochimaru to take his son, Minato would have returned from the Shinigami's stomach to haunt him. Additionally, Kushina would have easily defeated him instead of having to claw her way through the stomach lining. Of course not. Ero-sensei, you think that bastard Danzo would have let him take me to a mission anyway? Even though I would totally have gone with him, Naruto said. Kabuto said glibly, I would have taken you anywhere if you asked, which made Naruto wince. Please stop helping me now, he moaned, raising his chin in defiance as he turned to face Jiraiya. Jiraiya had last seen that expression when he was trying to persuade Naruto to stop pursuing Sasuke. So we played ninja, and I was pretty good at finding blackmail and recruiting these genjutsu characters, but I didn't blackmail them into it, so don't start going on about bad influence, okay? Thank you, Anbu training simulations, and I helped Kabuto with his colors. And look, it's a private thing and you wouldn't like it if, I don't know, Tsunade Bachan started airing your private business for the whole world to see, right? So, I'm only going to say that Kabuto started forgetting something really important and I reminded him. He gave Orochimaru the boot and came back to Konoha and brought Sasuke back to me because he had made a promise to me, and loyalty's a two-way street. He needed colors. I gave him colors. I needed him to return and he returned. He isn't going to tell my secrets and I'm not telling his. I know what I'm doing and I have the track record to prove it. We're going to kill Orochimaru unless he's still one of your precious people. However, Jiraiya believed that this was the best declaration of independence available. What a complete headache. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, don't worry, any lingering feelings I might have had for Orochimaru died with Sensei. This occurred after he abandoned Naruto for less than 2 months to be fair, though, a lot of it had begun years earlier. He had missed it years ago. Right under his nose it was very evident that Danzo had been Kabuto's teacher. It was also evident that those colors were a common metaphor for something else. But Jiraiya required additional background information to pinpoint the precise meaning. He searched for the final detail that would complete the picture. And what made you decide to ask Naruto for your colors? He asked. He didn't want to try to put any pressure on Naruto because, win or lose, he felt that this was one matter that, if not handled carefully, could cost him the trust of his students. Kabuto spoke slowly, his eyes penetrating the past as if he were trying to recall something for the first time in a long time. It had to be someone loyal, someone who wasn't damaged goods yet, who would be worth the dirty work I was doing. Someone who embodied Konoha, someone who was Konoha, he said. Gods, he couldn't even recall why he had initially selected Naruto. And I knew that Naruto-sama was born to be that to the whole village, even if, living in denial, Konoha couldn't bear to admit it. It wasn't even that hard to figure out. I intended to tell Naruto-sama once he became a little older and more careful about keeping secrets, but by then, he was more Konoha to me than Konoha itself. In the end it was nothing for me to betray the village, because losing it meant nothing as long as I didn't lose Naruto-sama. Loyalty to Konoha was one of his colors, not mine. He turned to look at Naruto like he was seeing the boy for the first time a second time around. Naruto grumbled, I really didn't think loyal to the village. Konoha wasn't obvious. Kabuto shrugged, and Jiraiya read a lot of contradictory things into the gesture, but nothing at the same time. I think it was, in the very beginning, but then Danzo happened again after that. I could only see what I had explicitly been given to see. I apologize, Naruto-sama. He was beginning to get a headache from the whole thing. I chose you because you embody Konoha, Naruto-sama, and I always intended to tell you why you are the son. Don't. Of Yondaime Hokage Namikaze Minato. Yondaime. Kurama impatiently awaited an opportunity to exploit. Any opportunity, any chakra surge, any emotional outburst, within the seal. His free will had been stolen by the bloody eyes of Uchiha Madara, the tainted version of the Rikudo Sennin's heritage. Senju Hashirama was later freed with the assistance of his wife, Uzumaki, after proving to be a fruit from the same tree. Although Kurama had at least been able to make them pay for it with their lives, the yellow-haired man whose shadow still plagued the seal and his wife had pulled a replica of the same. He had ingested all of this, including the bitter chalk, and he reveled in the hatred. However, now that these cultists were going to use his father's name however they saw fit, Kurama had finally had enough. It was difficult to determine how much time had passed inside the seal. A silvery flash finally pierced his host's body with an intensity that was nearly equal to physical pain, though it might have been a very long time since the last time. Why didn't anyone tell me that I was happy, my father? There was only a crazy whirl of surprise, disbelief, and yearning pride, bitterness. Not hate, although it wasn't hate or Kurama's demand. Its raw power was so great that it left Naruto vulnerable and enabled him to reach out through the seal and pull with the ebb and flow of chakra. The shape of a human child fell down the made-up corridor that led to the cage's bars, with the strong, brittle seal keeping it closed. The blonde human worm grinned and said, "Oh, hey, furball, guess what? I have a father." With no fear at all, Kurama snarled and flung himself against the bars. As a result, though far more pointless, the force of that desperate lunge was nearly as powerful as Naruto's revelation. Kurama yelled, "Let me out so I can devour you and your cult and your village," with such intensity that the human worm recoiled, and he felt gratified, picturing his voice shattering the brittle self-image. The boy worm clucked his tongue before blowing a raspberry at Kurama, which was just too much. "No way I'm gonna let you out. You stupid fox, my dad died to put you in there, you know, and my mom too, and I don't want anyone devoured. My father is dead as well and you are using his name to your own ends. The arrogance of that. Well, you killed my father, you bastard, so you don't, wait a second, you had a father?" No words could calm Kurama's anger, even though it wouldn't have mattered what Uzumaki Naruto said. This only served to highlight how short human memory was. Of course I had a father. Did you think I butted from Jubi's side like a runner from strawberry? Without his actions I never would have come to be. For Kurama, time was not measured by the changing of the seasons but rather by climatic shifts, plagues, the births and deaths of summon creature leaders, and the tidal waves of hatred that toppled entire empires. His father's era was considered ancient history by humans. The human grumbled and raised his hands to shield his ears, saying, "You have no idea what indoor voice means, right? Who was Jubi?" The shock of this boy's ignorance was beginning to pierce Kurama's anger. Jubi was a primordial entity that sought to destroy the world, the sage of the six paths. My father fought it. he was aware that people were prone to forgetting things, but to forget the greatest human being in history. Rakuto was dead, and this species had only one chance to save it. Dead. Wishing the dead had been immortal was useless. For the first time in his long life, Kurama fell completely silent as the boy worm babbled. The sage of the six paths was your father? And, had sex with this Jubi? Was it some kind of enemy kunoichi attraction thing? The sentence structure made sense, and he understood every word, but the words sounded like incomprehensible fleshy noise in his ears. Sorry, I guess you don't want to think about your dad having sex, right? I mean, I don't even remember mine and I don't want. Had sex with this Jubi, too. I wonder who my mother was. She must have been Uzumaki since dad's name was Namikaze, but nobody ever told me her name. Something that attracts enemy kunoichi. How dare you mock me? I will be free even if it is the last thing I will ever do, and then I will utterly destroy you. Then, with a clang that was more audible than felt in the bones, Kurama threw himself against the bars once more. The gate's seal rustled like the golden silk paper on his father's palace lanterns, a fragile and priceless item, but the damned thing held. The boy's body was open and almost relaxed, and his chakra radiated plaintively, indoor voice. And I wasn't mocking you, but if Jubi was your mother and he was your father, how come they got you if they didn't have sex? He asked. He didn't appear frightened or even ruthless. Kurama took offense. The boy's face, with red hair framing it, and blue eyes that resembled those haunted his memories. Damn it to hell, blood-red skin and hair, a child alive and death gasping. He clarified, wondering why he had bothered. Rakuto Sennin fought Jubi and sealed it inside his own body, but if he had died, the beast would have escaped, and he was only a mortal man, so he split it into 9 biju. His children. Why teach someone who was too stupid to understand it, someone who had to perish in order to restore Kurama's freedom? The boy pointed at him and yelled, "Hey, you said strawberry." Kurama blinked, questioning once more whether his hearing was impaired or perhaps he had hallucinated the entire conversation because the captivity had finally gotten to him. He asked, "What?" despite the fact that he probably shouldn't support his own fantasies. The boy laughed and Kurama looked at him through the bars. "You said strawberry earlier, don't try to deny it. You're Kyuubi, and you said strawberry." "That's funny," Kurama said. He sensed that he was rapidly losing control of the conversation when a foreign chakra rippled through the seal. He opened his mouth, unsure of how to return to the original point. He knew that the boy's teacher was attempting to awaken him by calling his consciousness back from the seal. Kurama was not even sure if he was disappointed. "Look, I gotta go now, but I really am sorry your dad is dead. That sucks," said the kid. Kurama was left staring at the spot on the floor where he had been standing when he flickered like the heart of a burned-out candle. "What?" Kurama measured time in eras rather than years because human lives were so brief. It may have made sense for them to celebrate each new year after his father's passing. Kurama had not bothered with the custom, but now he couldn't get rid of the thought that, for better or worse, this completely unremarkable year was the start of something completely different. What has been done cannot be undone. History is indestructible. Time is that ruthless dimension where only one direction of motion is possible. Discounting the most extreme rumors about Sharingan, which have never been verified and are most likely wishful thinking and denial on steroids. However, history can also be oddly adaptable. A single choice can lead to a completely different choice. Zabuza's decision to enroll in the Kirigakure Ninja Academy that year. Zabuza may have massacred the entire graduating class in an attempt to get into the school system when he wasn't yet a student. Kirigakure had instituted a new graduation ceremony during the 4th Mizukage's rule, in which the graduating class members were pitted against one another in death matches. This was further evidence that Uchiha Madara had far-reaching problems, though it would take a while to discover this as he watched his alleged peers attempt to strike the edges of the target with a kunai and have it land with the blade forward. He concluded that it was far better than spending feudal years in the academy. But Zabuza passed a kunoichi hopeful on his way to the training grounds. Because of her poor nutrition in her early years, she was small and almost trembling with fear for the first time in his life. Zabuza felt sorry for her because she was crying because she was positive she wouldn't live to see another day. When he inquired about the girl's name, it was revealed to be Noriko, who had no family name and was just another orphan who had joined the academy in order to have a place to live and 3 meals a day. She gave him the name of her opponent when he asked. When Noriko's match finally arrived, Zabuza challenged the boy she had been paired with and defeated him with ease. He then demanded entry to the academy, which he could have easily obtained by simply entering and writing his name on the entrance form, or, since he was unable to read or write at the time, asking someone else to do so. After 10 minutes of sympathy, He completed a full year at the academy and then massacred all of the teachers because he was so angry about it. The village government decided that the instructors were unfit to handle a first-year student's blade and that if a student killed an academy teacher, they would automatically graduate. This only made the teachers even more suspicious. After running for office and joining the Seven Swordsmen of the Mist, Zabuza later attempted a coup, ran away for his life, and became just another missing nin from the bloody village, but it wasn't. Although they were difficult to see, this action had a lot of effects. Due to a bureaucratic error and the publicity surrounding the death of a graduating student by a pre-academy hopeful, Noriko survived to graduate without engaging in combat, but this only gave her an additional 2 years of life before she perished on her first B-ranked mission. More significantly, there was no cancellation of the graduation ceremony. Since sanity wasn't one of Toba's strong points and Madara was as easy to reason with as a rock, many more people continued to perish in the ensuing years. As a result, Kiri's forces gradually started to dwindle because the new ninja didn't fully compensate for those who went missing or died in the line of duty. 1 year after Mizushima Konatsu and her half-brother Kaide, the graduation inconsequential students, escaped their match, the practice was finally called off because that damned Senju had not been mistaken about something not working. Kiri was left considerably diminished, and Madara was more enraged than a beehive that had just been struck by a stick. Additionally, many people who might have survived were killed, but Madara wasn't particularly concerned about that. However, some individuals survived who would have otherwise perished. In fact, half of the graduating class of the year Zabuza made his bloody entry into the ranks survived. Mori Satoshi was skilled in both taijutsu and ninjutsu. He advanced swiftly to the position of chunin, where he was immediately chosen for a special program designed for those with the potential to be intelligent. He rose quickly to the rank of junin, but his lifestyle caused him to age too quickly. When a young white-haired boy walked up to him in one of Kiri's ninja bars, he had wrinkles around his eyes and strands of gray in his hair. "You are too young to make that kind of career choice, Brad. Go play ninja with your genin team. If you can't trust yourself to remember who you are, pick someone to remember it for you and do whatever they think you would do." Something else would have been said by another man. The smallest air current was created by a butterfly's wings flapping, but given enough time, those have a way of growing, as they say. The rest is history. It cannot be altered because it is inscribed in stone. Naruto was ecstatic when he realized whose child he was. His mother was Uzumaki Kushina, the last Uzumaki, although she hadn't been referred to as such because the Uzumaki had a far lower collective stick up their ass than the Uchiha. His father was Namikaze Minato, the Yellow Flash and Naruto's greatest hero. It's also possible that his mother screamed that she didn't want to be reminded that she wasn't going to be the last because she was going to have children, and that she attempted to kick the first person who called her that in the head. And damn it, be Hokage, Jiraiya sensei told him. Anyway, Naruto chose to ask Jiraiya sensei after he pondered how long his mother had persisted in challenging his father to friendly training spars for stealing the hat. The fact that he couldn't tell anyone was really the only thing that was bothering him. The horde's petty enough to take revenge on a dead man's son wouldn't even be your worst trouble, Jiraiya sensei had stated. Not that there won't be plenty of those once the truth comes out. The real problem will be the people who look at your father and mother's respective careers and lineages and decide to preempt a reenaction of the last war. You don't have a keke genkai, but there's nothing wrong with your bloodline or everything, depending on the point of view. Naruto had complained. Why care about that? It's not like there's a war brewing or anything, but all he got in return was a blank look. Jiraiya sensei had remarked, "We are shinobi, there's always a war brewing." Thus, even though it was difficult, he was keeping his mouth shut. Even though it was well past midnight, he had to leave the house to get rid of some of the excitement. Naruto was positive he wouldn't fall asleep even then, but perhaps he could sit down and not bother the others as much. It was really inconvenient to have just one sleeping room. Naruto discovered he wasn't the only one awake once he was outside. Tomomi, the woman Jiraiya had brought along, was sitting on the wall separating the safe house's yard from the nearby geisha house. Gazing at the setting moon despite the red lanterns of the geisha house behind her, she appeared colorless in the moonlight, a pale, dull brown at first glance. Naruto believed that Miwa-chan had taken her to bed with the other girls. The second thing that came to mind was how depressed she appeared. He hopped to sit on the wall beside her and said, "Hey, Tomomi-chan? Is something wrong? Did something bad happen?" Tomomi-chan kicked the wall viciously, causing the old bricks to crack slightly. "I don't think that anything good can happen that will make you go missing, nin. Though I'm not sure if I'm just presumed dead. Instead, I have a lover, you know? His name is Deidara and I have no idea where he is or if he even is still alive." Naruto patted her hand and inquired, "What happened?" In fact, this wasn't how these things usually went, so he was a little confused at first. Some people fought and some fled, but typically, people didn't just talk to him in that way without initially making things difficult for everyone. It was throwing him off balance. The Anbu of our village tried to kill me, or, I'm not even sure of that. The man was dressed as an Anbu, but Tsuchikage-sama knew that we were together for more than 7 months. So why make an issue out of it now? But whether it was Iwa or someone else doesn't change the outcome. Deidara tried to kill Tsuchikage-sama and blew up his tower. He can never return to Iwa now, and neither can I after running away with one of the Sannin to search for him. And since Jiraiya-san's network hasn't found him yet, all I can do is sit tight in Konoha with no idea of when they will trust me enough to let me out of the village. I never thought I would become a missing nin for anything, but I guess we all have our price after all. She was tired rather than angry for once. Naruto almost scolded himself for not having a price before congratulating himself for deliberating before blurting out the first thing that came to mind, but he did share his second thought with her. Tomomi-chan turned to look at him as he said, I just drag him back by the hair. I'll do it for you if I ever see him. What does he look like? Naruto writhed beneath her stare, as if she could simultaneously read his thoughts and pierce his brain. But he wasn't going to back down from his promise. Technically speaking, I'm not supposed to tell strange ninja about this. But that cat's so out of the bag, it must be in another country by now, and having little rumor kittens there, I would have dragged Sasuke back from Orochimaru if Kabuto hadn't brought him in that barrel, and I'm going to bring your Deidara back. This is the promise of a lifetime. Tomomi-chan said, I think you will do your best, in a perplexed tone. Then she smiled, and suddenly she didn't look quite so colorless. You are Jiraiya-san's student, and apparently a Jinchuriki as well. A generous commitment from you. Considering we only met today, I think that considering that promise, you can call me Tomomi-ni-chan, little brother. Naruto was reminded that she was, in fact, very attractive, though obviously not nearly as attractive as Sakura-chan. He was able to call her Ne-chan, too. Although they weren't really, other kids always called them Ne-chan and Ni-chan, but no one had ever permitted Naruto to use that name before. Perhaps Uruka-sensei did, but he was already Naruto's instructor. Deidara has a slim build, and a beautiful face with slanted blue eyes and long blonde hair that he wears in a half ponytail with the rest hanging down his back. Remember, he thinks I'm dead, so if you meet him, tell him, the first time we went out together I told him I can never keep my flowers alive. Bringing me a cactus to the hospital was a beautiful thought, but really, learning flower language first would have spared us from an embarrassing misunderstanding. He then went on to learn Hanakodaba, Ikebana, Sumii, and how to play shamisen. All of those skills were used in a mission he will deny to his dying day he ever took part in, and I will deny I kept a picture of him in a pink kimono. In the end, I gave him a cactus and later he blew up the potting soil, and that makes him officially even worse with flowers than I am. Naruto pondered and asked what kind of miscommunication a cactus could create. Then he blushed as a vague memory of Sakura-chan discussing flowers with Ino came back to him. Instead, he said, do you still have that picture, Tomomi-ne? And she shook her head and stifled a chuckle. Too bad, I had to leave it. That's what you gets for being prettier than your girlfriend, she replied, though it didn't completely vanish. Her smile grew smaller and sadder. The first time we were out of the village together, I was tortured because I wouldn't betray my village. Now we're missing nin. This is the world we live in. He would not let the Yondaime Hokage and Uzumaki Kushina's son down. Well, then it's up to us to make it a place worth fighting for, right? In actuality, Otogakure would have done a better job of describing the Wind Country's hidden village than Orochimaru did, even though it was called Sanagakure no Sato, or the village hidden by sand. Suna was never quiet. The wind turbine generators whooshed as they spun electricity, the windmills that pumped water from the rivers deep beneath the bone-dry sands whined and rattled, and the blustery winds yowled between the homes despite the village's loudness. The residents were silent. According to Tamari, this was the character of Suna Shinobi. They were just as lethal and as silent as the scorpions in the desert. It was because they could hardly hear their thoughts over the wind, let alone spoken words, Konkuro explained. On some days, Gaara was prepared to purchase his brother's version. Being from the most prominent Suna lineage, he and Tamari most definitely did not have an innate need to be quiet. Every time Gaara entered the room, they used to go silent, but now they had all but forgotten that fearful obedience, and he liked it that way. When Yashimaru attempted to kill him, it had been one of the few quiet nights. His ninja continued to become motionless and silent in an effort to avoid his notice, and although Gaara wasn't a noisy person, he became anxious when he heard other people's silence. With a look of disgust, Tamari said, most of them are pregnant. As Gaara entered his office, she had a pile of papers on her lap. As she sat in front of his desk, Gaara let out a sigh and pondered whether Naruto realized how much paperwork would be waiting for him once his dream came true. Konkuro said, You say that like there was something wrong with getting pregnant, with a tone of voice that Gaara understood to be an attempt to entice Temari. It was odd how much he had discovered about his siblings simply by listening for the first time. Temari snorted, and Gaara realized that the thought made her feel disgusted. I have nothing against pregnancy. I wouldn't be here if mother hadn't gotten pregnant. But those idiots get pregnant practically before they even start getting B-rank missions, and there goes a career down the drain. Why in hell would anyone waste years of training and surviving near misses just when they were about to succeed? Besides, I have enough on my plate keeping you in line, Kankuro, and with the factions opposing Gaara. But you're even more boneheaded than they are. Oh, good morning, Gaara. Good morning, Temari, Kankuro, Gaara said, observing how his presence caused Kankuro to repress his objections. Temari's timing was undoubtedly deliberate. Gaara enjoyed taking in details about his sister and brother. He would have attempted to smile at them, but Temari cautioned that it didn't look right if it was forced, and had requested that he smile only if his mouth did so naturally. However, this had been at the start of their new, better relationship, and Gaara hadn't tried to smile since, so no other hurtful remarks had been made. Kankuro had said that his grin fell just short of pants pissing scary when he thought Gaara was out of hearing range. Having to deal with people was challenging. Perhaps he could write to Naruto to seek guidance. Gaara didn't move to strike up a discussion. After a little while, Temari handed him the papers on the desk and said, I have a few ranked missions for you to look over. All missions ranked D through B could be approved by the Suna mission office, but anything higher required the Kage's personal approval. Kankuro joked, and number 4.5 has something he wants to speak about, as he inserted a fresh poisoned needle into one of his smaller puppet's hands. Temari whooshed more than she sighed. The poor man has a name too, you know, she continued. The impoverished man, Yoshiro, was elected Suna's temporary leader while the village discussed who would be their next Kage. He was a Junin and a capable administrative leader, but he lacked the aptitude and motivation to become a Kage, which had made him the person responsible for running the village and overseeing the rebuilding of the destroyed ninja forces. While the village council quarreled to the man's dismay, Kankuro had given him the nickname number 4.5 as a joke, and it had stuck. The councilors couldn't bring themselves to name Gaara as Godem, but they were seriously out of options, so Yoshiro ended up spending 7 months behind the Kage's desk. The sad reality was that Suna had significantly declined under the current daimyo's control, and even the strongest and most seasoned shinobi in the village were extremely cautious about attempting to seize something Gaara obviously desired. With the exception of Gaara, whose change of heart no one yet fully trusted, their strongest were too old for the position. The council couldn't push the hat on Gaara quickly enough after the daimyo eventually began voicing his opinion that the village didn't really need a Kage and that all that was needed in the modern era was a competent administrative leader. He had the ideal cousin in mind. At least Gaara had persuaded Yoshiro that he had changed during the lengthy weeks that made up the office's change of guard. Even though it didn't feel particularly satisfying, Gaara liked the older shinobi, who had taken on the role of mentor for the bureaucratic aspects of the job. And we need to set some kind of incentive for the kunoichi to wait longer until they start to make babies, Temari insisted. We're still short on manpower after the invasion, and will be several years more. The last thing we need is for the young and promising to retire young to stay in the kitchen. Damn patriarchal societal norms about mothers being the only caretakers, and since when can't people at least hire nannies if they insist on spawning before they even hit their 20s anyway? Gaara ceased to hear her. There was something at the edge of his hearing, but he knew she could go on and on when she got like this, a metallic sound, something melodic and light. The source was outside the window. He thought, like little bells, and Temari stopped talking, knowing that even the most unusual noises could signal an assassination attempt. She and Kankuro, both skilled ninjas, strained to hear what Gaara had. Kankuro said, I think it's more like chimes, but he remained tense as Gaara approached the window. Although Suna lacked Konoha's tower, the Kage's building was still tall. With Gaara's office on the top floor, the crowd below him initially appeared to be weird white mushrooms. The 13-person group was openly guarded by 2 shinobi and covertly by 5 others. They all wore the most bizarre outfit Gaara had ever seen on a civilian. A wooden staff, all white clothing that had turned brownish with dust, and a white straw hat that resembled an upside-down bowl that concealed the majority of their faces. The winds played a melody, and each of them held a wind chime in their hand. Leaning out of the window to get a better view of the pilgrims, Kankuro questioned, We have pilgrims here? Is there a civil war somewhere with an important temple or something? What are pilgrims? Scowled Gaara. Apparently, everyone was supposed to be aware of this additional fact. Kankuro clarified, they're people who travel to holy places so the gods will like them better, and Temari made a tiny, mocking sound in the back of her throat. Generally speaking, religions were of little use to ninjas. Their job descriptions mixed with inconvenient rules like, do not kill, and do not covet. Like oil and water however, Naruto had created his own cult. Gaara wasn't certain that Naruto had ever killed anyone, but he always did things his way. But if he had, he was certain that whoever it had been had earned it well. He had invaded Konoha and Naruto hadn't even killed him. As he said, I want to believe in something. I wonder if those clothes are mandatory. His siblings made noises that sounded like strangulation. He questioned whether Naruto's cult worshipped any gods. His intelligence people claimed that Naruto was primarily worshipped. He wanted to smile when he saw Naruto thrashing around, red-faced and embarrassed. Before Temari or Kankuro could express their opinions about his spiritual inclinations, a knock on the door cut them off 2 hours prior to his appointment. It was Yoshiro, and Gaara was aware that he had been sent because, aside from his siblings, he was the person Gaara was least likely to kill, and because he wouldn't have objected. For the first time since Gaara had met him, Yoshiro was at a loss for words. Kazekage-sama, we seem to have pilgrims who have come to that is. Damn it. Yoshiro swore and used the back of his hand to wipe his hair off his forehead. They are followers of Narutoism. Uzumaki Naruto has declared you a living saint who protects the world from the evil of the Biju within you. They have requested to be allowed to meet you so that they can give you their offerings and pray for your health and long life, and they want moral teachings. Gaara approached them. Temari was following him as if she were in a trance, and Kankuro was complaining that if Gaara was permitted to teach that religion morals, it was ruined. Even though Gaara himself had some reservations, however, it didn't seem like an unfair trade, and these people wanted this. His long life had never been prayed for. He was positive that many had instead prayed for a quick and unexpected death to gods they didn't even believe in. Temari muttered, just say what you think Naruto would say, as the audience chamber doors opened. When Gaara entered the audience chamber, there were 5 men and 8 women present. They knelt on the stone floor as one. Salutations to him who stands up for the world, peaceful, independent and radiant, pure like white camphor, the incarnation of compassion. They sang. Anbu fell from the ceiling. The pilgrims praised a variety of qualities that Gaara was unaware he possessed, beginning with gentle and religious qualities like truth and compassion before moving into the realm of strength and demonstrating each of these qualities through battle. At that point, it all made sense. Very much like Naruto, he said contentedly as the chanting came to an end. One of the women stood up from the floor, gathered all the wind chimes, and then walked to Gaara with her eyes downcast in respect. Gaara-sama, I am Riza, the leader of our pilgrimage. In the name of all our Makima sisters and brothers, I wish to present you with these chimes so that their sound may drive away evil spirits, and with prayers for your good health and long life, she said. Her dark hair was flecked with gray, and she looked the oldest. I also wish to tell you of the marvelous meeting on our way here. A young man happened upon our company, and he was revealed to be the good brother of Yondaime Raikage and the Jinchuriki of Gyuki, Killer B. He couldn't enter the village, but he wishes to meet with you as well. Kazekage-sama. One of the Anbu emerged from a genjutsu, wringing his hands and approaching them quickly. Your safety. Kankuro questioned, wait, didn't he go missing? Again, except Raikage didn't declare him missing. Nin, for some reason he just wants him back, yesterday. Another Anbu opened the balcony door, and a powerful gust of wind entered, causing the chimes Gaara was holding by their strings to jingle. The chimes continued to tinkle. Gaara loved the sound. It was something new. People who lived in a country he had never visited, people he had never met, had traveled thousands of miles to express their hope that he would not be devoured by a demonic spirit. Naruto had assured him that he would eventually be accepted if he decided to protect others. He wasn't going to gripe, but he hadn't anticipated it being by Tea Country. I will meet with Killer B, he said, grinning. When Naruto redeems a promise, he doesn't settle for half measures. It was much smaller than one of Naruto's grins that he had previously attempted to imitate. However, it felt right, and nobody recoiled in response. Kazekage-sama, please. Naruto had benefited greatly from Makima. Of course, there would be bombs. Tsubaki had reviewed some fundamentals he hadn't bothered to learn in the academy, but that turned out to be somewhat essential as the foundation for learning other things. While Idate and Guy had first smoothed out his taijutsu and Konatsu-chan had taught him some evil water jutsu. Furthermore, Makima ultimately made Naruto wealthy. Naruto used the wealth of the Yakuza family he had destroyed as a reward to aid the girls he had rescued. He practically used it up to the last Ryo to convert the old bordellos into inns and create the fire department fund. He believed that the money was well spent because his new friends were now secure and settled. However, investments are meant to increase profits, and Naruto had some extremely loyal staff members. Soon, the casino boat and the inns began to generate revenue, and even after the wages and other expenses required to operate a business, There was a healthy monthly surplus. It added up because Naruto never visited Makima to take money out of the account. Kaide refused to let Konatsu place a bet on how long it would take Naruto to realize he was wealthy and how much he would care when he heard a sucker's bet. He knew it. Additionally, there were now religious paintings of Naruto, and although the majority of them were just as accurate as the Hokage mountain sculptures, some people were still able to identify Naruto from them. He was perplexed by the people giving him rice because, presumably, holy people should receive bowls of it, but he at least understood that they were shielding them from bandits and the like. In the end, Konatsu and Kaide remained in Makima. The climate was pleasant, Konatsu concluded, and even though the place was a little dull now that Naruto was gone, that was a challenge rather than a barrier. Kaide liked it there. Anyway, together with Idate, they kept training the fire department until it was the only one in the world that also functioned as a paramilitary unit. A group of mercenaries and the shipping magnate who had employed them discovered that even Genin level was more than sufficient to defeat non-shinobi. Even though none of the girls attained Shunin level of proficiency, Takumo comforted himself by thinking that at least the instigator had left before he could worsen the situation, even though they had managed to give the poor police chief gray hairs. Over breakfast, his wife read him a letter. You have been made an honorary member of the fire brigade, because Sato felt bad he thought you were a chauvinist. Many words are unsuitable for repeated use. Idate stayed in Makima to court Miwa while negotiating a shipping agreement between Naruto's company and the Wasabi family at Tri number 17. He was able to persuade her to agree to a date. He understood that this did not yet indicate that Miwa had fallen in love with him, but he was working on it. Furthermore, any possible rivals were at least deterred by Miwa's ardent religious devotion. It was completely by accident that the Great Naruto Fire Brigade became a tourist attraction. One of the large pavilions constructed by the sea caught fire during the Mermaid Festival a year after it was founded. It was handled very quickly because half of the fire department was already there to celebrate. Very gaudy, too. Even though the tourists got wet, they thought the actual jutsu was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. The fire department started holding fire drills to give them something to look at when it was safe and to keep the public away when there was actually a fire, because they were irritated by the crowd taking pictures of them while they were attempting to perform their duties. Within 2 years, firefighting became a traditional female occupation. It was universally acknowledged as the fastest growing gender normative tradition in history. Miwa organized the Church of Naruto and cheerfully propagated Narutoism. Even though she was unaware that many of the individuals who approached her were foreign agents attempting to decipher Konoha's ruse, she would have responded to the inquiries in the same manner. A woman is a formidable presence when she is certain that she is correct according to those agents. The Church of Naruto promoted global peace, and the group's pastime was creating explosives from food. The High Priestess said this was perfectly reasonable and reasonable. In Konoha, Naruto gained a small following to Uruka's dismay. Sai took the religion very seriously and was able to win over the other rootlets, as Tsubaki called her, and Uruka's new charges, to his way of thinking. This was more of a moral support thing for Tsubaki, Kakashi, Hinata, Neji, and the Ichirakus than anything else. He declined to join, even as a joke, because it was his duty as a teacher to set a good example and teach kids that joining cults was wrong. And his hard work was wasted. He was able to keep Sai away from the kids before he started talking about tantric sex rituals, which he saw as a minor win because Sai had not yet come to understand that ideas like age-appropriate subjects were in place for a reason, and that, although being truthful when answering questions could be beneficial. Unless one were to argue that challenges were a religious matter to the two, Guy and Lee did not truly convert to Narutoism because they were true believers. One morning, after Kakashi had just returned from a week-long mission and wanted to just sleep for another week, Guy happened to bug him about choosing a challenge. Before he shunned away, Kakashi named being a good, devoted cultist his challenge because sleep deprivation always had a terrible effect on his sense of humor. When he woke up the following day, he deeply regretted this, but the damage was already done since Naruto's location was unknown. They traveled to Suna, where Lee bonded with a perplexed Gaara and gave his Anbu severe headaches because Lee insisted on sparring with the Cage. A number of them became afraid of intervillage incidents. He continued to lose, but it didn't deter him in the least. When Tsunade learned of this, she became extremely inebriated. Shizune didn't reprimand her for once. Nobody understood why Hyuga Hiyashi permitted Hinata and Neji to continue being even nominal members of the cult, and the only person who was foolish enough to inquire, Inuzuka Sume, wasn't curious enough to pursue the matter. Perhaps it was related to a training spar in which Hinata had actually defeated Neji, and Neji had grinned and congratulated her. It was an absolute nightmare to clean up after Danzo. To get a little more manpower to clean up the mess that was Root, many former Anbu, including Kakashi, were called back into service. As a result, Kakashi ended up using the codename and masked up for 2 weeks, which was somewhat problematic because many of the old masks had been put back into use. Ibiki still has blackmail photos, despite the fact that he discovered and destroyed 2 stashes. After more than a year of trying to sort out the rootlets, Uruka and Tsubaki were finally considered as sane as anyone had ever been in Konoha. Despite Tsubaki's best efforts to make things right, they ended up in the same bed, just sleeping, because they were intoxicated and Uruka was the responsible type. They celebrated this with a wonderfully quiet movie night and a bottle of sake. They became friends with Taiki and Tomomi after they began dating, and, now that they had some free time, they bonded over living with the local loons, also known as Konoha nin. By shinobi standards, Sasuke's transformation into a missing nin was essentially a slap on the wrist, but he got away with it. This was caused in part by the Sharingan, in part by Tsunade's soft spot for Naruto and Sakura, in part by the fact that she was able to vicariously redeem a fallen teammate, and last but not least, because the entire Uchiha massacre was an unjustified atrocity that severely damaged a young boy's head, and Sasuke ought to have been made to attend therapy regardless of how much he wanted to. His clearance was revoked for a year and he was placed on probation. He was prohibited from leaving Konoha. He was informed that he was being closely watched and that the TNI would be provided with a thorough report if he spoke while he slept, made a shopping list, or even greeted a grocery store employee. In addition, he had to attend therapy, which he saw as a form of discipline. However, Tsunade wasn't a moron, so he kept training. Naturally, Karen's decision to defect and follow him to the village also served as a punishment because Tsunade, in a moment of pettiness, ignored all advice and took her in with him. But as soon as Sakura learned, she regretted the choice. Kabuto was still Kabuto. The only people who trusted him were Konohamaru and his friends, who were thrilled when someone referred to their Naruto Nichin as Naruto-sama. He made everyone uneasy. He was also sent to therapy, but he didn't trust his therapists enough to genuinely allow them to help him because he knew the answers to all of their questions, which annoyed them. Although Kabuto was courteous to everyone, he nearly avoided being unnerving around Uruka. He was always polite to Uruka. It sort of worked out because Uruka returned the favor by supporting Naruto, more for his benefit than anything else. However, Kabuto valued this much more than if Uruka had done so for his benefit. Things got even more complicated outside of Konoha. Orochimaru was furious because he had suddenly lost both his right hand and his new designer body. He made multiple attempts to get in touch with Sasuke once more, catch up to Naruto, and get some well-earned retribution. And, now that he thinks about it, that unique Uzumaki chakra was also intriguing. However, Jiraiya reluctantly accepted Kabuto's help, and they were able to keep Orochimaru busy protecting his base in the rice country. In one of his letters, Jiraiya bitched to Tsunade, saying, "It's a sad day indeed because Orochimaru could be considered small potatoes." As one might anticipate, Narutoism was viewed by the other great hidden villages as an attempt to entice their Jinchuriki to defect in order to obtain political and financial power in their nations. Not all of these effects were bad. Tsunade's reputation had suffered greatly during the years she squandered drinking and gambling, and now she was known as a brash, gorgeous bitch. She was obviously insane. But was there ever a Hokage who was completely sane? By sheer happenstance, Naruto had succeeded in persuading the elemental countries that Konoha was once again at the top of her game. However, the fact that his brother had become involved in the mess infuriated the Raikage. When the Yellow Flash was proclaimed a saint, the Iwa as a whole weren't particularly impressed. Even though Taiki wasn't very well known, he was an extremely skilled jonin, and they were short-staffed, which made Kiri even more upset about Naruto taking one of their hunter nin. It took years and years to train a small portion of all available ninja to that level of proficiency, and good hunter nin didn't just appear overnight. Daimyo Kazuhana Koyuki had always given preference to Konoha, but her treatment of Naruto exposed this bias and stoked a great deal of resentment, which was exacerbated by the fact that no one could argue Naruto hadn't earned it. Gaara didn't mind, and Tsunade praised any higher power who might dare to listen to a ninja who wasn't Jashin the Wind. Daimyo also became bitchy. The Jinchuriki were not consulted, and if they did offer any helpful or appropriate commentary, it could only be a lie, right? There was also Akatsuki.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.